Chapter 6. Buzz. Monday dawned, the sun shining cheerfully through her window. The lake outside Durmstrang Fortress was a sheet of pale glass, and the peaks of the mountains still glistened with snow. Hermione Granger, Morgenstern, she reminded herself grimly, was already awake. She had been awake since 5. Her timetable was pinned neatly above her desk. Her uniform was ironed and perfectly arranged. She was even wearing a fur hat, despite the fact that the weather did not require it at all. And since breakfast didn't begin until 7, she saw absolutely no reasonato use her extra time wisely. So, naturally, she decided to find the library. Unfortunately, Durmstrang had neglected to provide its students with something as civilized as AMAP. 10 minutes in, Hermione realized she might have slightly overestimated her innate sense of direction. Every hallway looked the same: dark wood panels, narrow archways, rune-etched sconces that began to glow only as she passed. Once, she was fairly sure Shed walked through the same corridor 3 times, though the portrait of the one-eyed witch, which was the first portrait she had seen on these walls, was blinking at her less judgmentally each round, so perhaps that was progress. Still, her persistence paid off. Because when Hermione finally found the library down a side hall that wasn't marked, behind an archway that looked suspiciously like a wall until she pushed on it, her breath caught. The place was enormous and practicoliative. The air itself seemed charged with intent, like magic waiting to strike. Books didn't just sit on shelves, they flew, fluttering like overactive owls before swooping back into place. The shelves reached dizzying heights, vanishing into a ceiling that didn't seem to exist. Ladders rolled on their own, somehow moving towards students before the poor souls even realized they needed one, hovering expectantly, like helpful dogs. Hermione's eyes sparkled. She had never seen anything so wonderful. But there was a certain edge to the place, too. The books weren't all friendly. Some of them were bound in peculiar scales that glimmered faintly, or chained to the shelves with links that occasionally hissed and rattled on their own. There was no sign or barrier marking a restricted section. In fact, there was no separation at all. It hit her slowly: any student could just wander up and open one of those enormous tomes, whispering to themselves on the top shelves. No permission, no larks, no warning labels. Hermione's logical mind reeled between awe and horror. "This is terribly unsafe," she whispered to herself, craning up at a leather-bound volume that had just hissed at her. Then, after a beat, she added, "But brilliantly organized. Oh, I just love how there's such clear sections for each language family, how clever, and everything's so well labeled." A passing student, tall, bleary-eyed, and carrying a book that looked suspiciously like it was trying to eat his sleeve, rolled his eyes at her and kept walking. Hermione ignored him entirely, too entranced. She wandered down one of the aisles, trailing her fingers reverently along the spines. Titles flickered between scripts she could and couldn't read: Elder Futhark, Old Slavonic, English, Latin, German, something entirely alien written in what looked disturbingly like blood. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. One of the hovering ladders clattered softly behind her, keeping pace as if it had adopted her. Hermione beamed at it. "Oh, thank you, but I am just browsing." The ladder paused, seeming to consider this, then retreated a few paces with the sulky dignity of a snubbed cat. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed again. 6:30. "Oh no," Hermione muttered, glancing at her watch. "Breakfast blasted. I've lost track of time." First impressions matter, Hermione. Honestly, she spun around, only to realize that the corridor Shed come through was nowhere to be seen. She frowned, trying to retrace her steps, but the shelves had subtly rearranged themselves. What had once been a straight corridor of books now twisted into a confusing maze. Oh, come on now," she muttered, brushing her hair out of her face. "This is utterly ridiculous. Libraries are meant to be navigable. How's anyone supposed to?" A soft creak sounded behind her. Hermione turned to find the same rolling ladder Shed seen earlier sitting squarely in the aisle, as though it had been waiting for her to notice. "You again," she said, hands on her hips. "You wouldn't happen to know how to get to the exit, would you?" The ladder gave what could only be described as an offended tilt, its wheels squeaking faintly as if to say, "And what makes you think I work for you?" Hermione's jaw dropped. "Oh, don't you start with that attitude. I am already going to miss my first breakfast, and it's my first day of classes too, so I need all the fortitude I can manage." The ladder rolled forward a few inches, not toward the exit, but deeper into the maze. Hermione frowned. "No, no, no, I am not falling for that. You're a leading me further in. I just want to leave." The ladder stood still for a moment, then rattled its rungs impatiently, like a scolding parent. Hermione blinked. "What, you want me to check something out first?" The ladder gave a decisive ecrique which she chose to interpret as finally, "She understands." "Fine," Hermione huffed. "Fine, one book. But then you're taking me right to the door," agreed. The ladder clattered once, approvingly, and began rolling away, its wheels squeaking faintly on the ancient floorboards. Hermione hurried after it, dodging a few floating tomes that whirred past her ears like angry pigeons. After several turns, the ladder stopped before a tall, shadowed shelf near the back. Hermione frowned. "This isn't the light reading section, is it?" The ladder, ignoring her entirely, positioned itself flush against the shelf and extended upward with a series of sharp metallic clicks. Hermione sighed. "You're insufferable, you know that." Still, she grabbed the side rails and began to climb. Her fingers were already smudged with dust by the time she reached the top, where only one book seemed to be missing from an otherwise solid row. As she reached for it, the ladder trembled beneath her. All right, I see it," she muttered, stretching out to grasp the spine. It was bound in thick, reddish-brown leather that gleamed faintly when her hand brushed it. The title was embossed in runes she didn't recognize, but it gave off a faint warmth. Hermione hesitated. Probably just another treatise on transfiguration, she told herself briskly, or an old dueling manual, perfectly harmless. She tugged the book free, and immediately a soft whispering sound rose from the gap in the shelf, like a breath drawn inward. Hermione blinked, clutching the book to her chest. "I am sure that's completely normal," she said weakly. "Right." The ladder made a superior little creak. Hermione didn't know how she knew it was being condescending, but she knew nonetheless. Somehow, Hermione muttered, beginning to descend, "I very much doubt that. Do you put all students through this on their first day, or just the ones you really dislike?" The ladder lowered a little, as if hurt. Hermione's heart panged. "The ones you like, I mean," she said hurriedly. Because you've helped me so today, and I can't imagine you're always doing such amazing work for every single student. I swear, I'll translate this and read it cover to cover. I don't know what it's on, but if the best ladder in the world gave it to me." Instantly, the ladder perked up and spun in a delighted circle, its wheels squealing like overexcited mice. Hermione, still clutching onto it, shrieked, "Stop, stop, you ridiculous contraption. I was complimenting you, not offering an audition for the ballet." She yelped, bushy hair whipping across her face. The ladder gave one last triumphant twirl before rolling to a dramatic stop, wobbling slightly, almost as though bowing. Hermione staggered down the last few steps, clutching her book and what was left of her dignity. "Brilliant," she muttered, trying to smooth her robes. "My first day at Durmstrang, and my closest thing to a friend is furniture." The ladder made a smug creak in reply. Hermione huffed, pointing a finger at it. "Don't look at me like that. I am onto you. You probably report directly Toto the professors or some such. This is probably a cruel test of some sort. Wouldn't surprise me if Master Capel keeps notes on which third years can't handle a bit of animated carpentry." The ladder inched backward, as if feigning innocence. Hermione rolled her eyes, then looked down at the book in her hands. "Well," she sighed, "whatever you are, you've officially made me late to breakfast. I hope you're worth it." She turned toward where she thought the exit was only for the ladder to gently roll ahead and tap one of its wheels against her ankle, then point itself decisively toward a narrow archway between shelves. Hermione blinked. "Oh, you're actually showing me the way out." The ladder gave yet another squeak. Right, she said, adjusting her grip on the book. Well, thank you. It trundled forward at a dignified pace, leading her through the maze of shelves until at last a sliver of daylight appeared ahead. Hermione stepped through the archway, blinking in the sudden brightness of the corridor. Behind her, the ladder gave a small, almost fawn click. Hermione frowned. Do you know where to check out books? I don't see a front desk. The ladder rolled forward, simply nudging Hermione towards the exit, before it rolled itself back into the shadows. I suppose there's some other form of record-keeping, then, muttered Hermione unsurely, leaving the library. When Hermione slipped into the great hall, most students were already halfway through their meals. She was breathless, and her hair was frizzing at its full storm cloud potential. At least 50 heads turned toward her as she tried to sneak in, which was, of course, impossible. Hermione Granger could no more sneak than thunder could politely whisper. She scanned the rows in mild panic until she spotted Emil sitting at the third-year table, a half-eaten roll on his plate and an empty seat beside him. His head was turned, gaze fixed somewhere toward the fourth years. Good morning. Hermione chirped, plopping into the seat next to him and nearly upsetting the jam dish. Emil jumped, blinking rapidly as though he'd been caught daydreaming. Oh, Hermione. Morning. Hermione followed his gaze curiously. A little way up, at the fourth-year table, the tall blonde girl who'd sat across from them yesterday, perfect hair, perfect posture, and what Hermione grudgingly admitted was a very perfect way of laughing, was leaning toward a boy with the same sunstruck coloring. They were speaking a lilting language that sounded vaguely Scandinavian. Emil was staring like someone who'd forgotten how to blink. Hermione raised an eyebrow, spearing a bit of egg that looked slightly less suspicious than the herring next to it. Friend of yours. Emil startled, then went red to the ears. Ah, yeah, sort of. We grew up together. Well, in different countries, though. I am Velstrian, she's Swedish. My dad and hers went to Durmstrang together, though, so. We knew each other since we were babies. And the playdates went on, and on, and on, and we attended the same junior magic circle to prepare for the Durmstrang entrance examination together, even. Hermione recognized Vilstria from the Durmstrang history coursebooks she had practically devoured. It was a wizarding state in the Baltic region, a land of ancient forests, windswept shores, and marshlands. Its magical community was tied deeply to nature magic, particularly ancient, elemental forces like wind, storm, and water. They were especially known for their use of weather manipulation and nature-based potions, relying on deep-rooted rituals that can trace back to pagan roots. Because of the fact they saw magic as connecting with the magical ancestors of a land, though they treated Muggle-borns as second-class citizens, restricting the kinds of magic they could use. Hermione doubted Emil would be very friendly at all to her if he knew exactly what she was. Oh, Hermione said simply, smiling. So she's in our year, then. Emil ducked his head, stabbing half-heartedly at his porridge as if it might save him from further conversation. She's a third year, same as us, he went on quietly. She's just over there because of Lars. He said Lars with much the same distaste Hermione had for the porridge she decided to get for breakfast. Her nose wrinkled as she swallowed some of it down. Do they intentionally make everything here taste awful? Hermione asked herself, shaking her head. Lars. Hermione asked, already certain she was not going to like this Lars. Emil's mouth twisted. A boy she has befriended. Thinks he's like Odin's gift to spellcraft or whatever. He's the one she's talking to. Hermione followed his glance again. Lars was the blond boy laughing with Astrid, tall, broad-shouldered, looking far too pleased with himself. Ah, she said. Yes, I see. Astrid's always been a really friendly girl, Emil added quickly as though trying to explain. Astrid, she's like that with everyone. Always surrounded by people. She can talk to anyone. He hesitated, pushing his spoon through his porridge. I never could, really. Something about the way he said it made Hermione's heart twitch, though she tried not to show it. Instead, she huffed primly, brushing a stray crumb off her sleeve. Well, she said, there's no shame in that. Some of us value quality over quantity. Personally, I've always thought it much better to have one true friend than 10 shallow ones. Emil smiled faintly, a little crooked and unsure. You think so? Of course, Hermione said briskly. I'd much rather spend my time improving myself than wasting it on idle chatter. Although she shot another look at Astrid, who was still laughing, well, I suppose she seems perfectly nice. Chasteness, Emil said, quickly, defensively. Just busy. Busy, Hermione echoed. Popular's an occupation, then. She'll probably come over later, Emil added, trying to sound hopeful. She's not like the others, really. Hermione gave him a sidelong look. Ill-reserved judgment until I see evidence, she said crisply, slicing her toast in perfect halves. But when Astrid looked up from her conversation and caught Emil's eye for a moment, smiling and waving before turning back to Lars, Hermione caught the giddy smile that spread across Emil's face as he almost fell out of his seat, waving back. After a while, a soft chime echoed through the great hall, clear, precise, and a blessed relief to Hermione's poor dung. She set down her spoon with more force than necessary, swallowing the last slick bite of porridge and trying not to shudder. Finally, she muttered, I was beginning to suspect this school was trying to poison me before classes even began. Emil snorted, standing and slinging his satchel over his shoulder. You'll get used to it. Eventually. Eventually, Hermione repeated, wrinkling her nose. That's a dismal promise. The flow of students began to stream toward the great arched doors, boots clacking on the black stone floor. Hermione gathered her notes, clutching them like a shield, and followed Emil into the corridor. The crowd divided as they walked first years, herded off toward the northern wing, the older students drifting toward their classrooms with a kind of military precision. History, according to the schedule, was held in the South Hall, but unfortunately, the actual corridors didn't seem to obey their own blueprints, twisting into new angles that hadn't existed on any map. Why did all magical schools have a weird sort of geometry? Hermione didn't know. Was it due to the concentrated magic, the powerful magic that rendered most unplottable? She was about to comment on that when a bright voice called out, Emil. Wait up. Hermione turned. Astrid was gliding toward them through the crowd, the morning sun from the high windows catching in her pale hair. Her robes were impeccable, and her smile was perfectly measured. Hi, Astrid, Emil said, his voice doing that soft, awkward thing again. Hi yourself, Astrid replied, eyes flicking to Hermione in polite curiosity. Nice to meet you again, Hermione. Yes, Hermione said eagerly, beaming. I am so pleased to talk to you again. I've heard your name already. Emil mentioned you were friends since childhood. Astrid's smile didn't waver, but it didn't quite reach her eyes either. Oh, did he? She said lightly, flicking a strand of gold hair behind her ear. How sweet. I hope Emil didn't talk too badly about me. She laughed lightly, as if knowing that wasn't even a possibility. Yes, he spoke very fondly of you, Hermione continued, delighted to have found what she thought was common ground. You seem quite popular here, too. It must be wonderful to have so many friends. Astrid let out another tinkling laugh. You're very kind. I suppose I do like meeting people. Durmstrang can be so. She paused, giving Hermione a long, slow once-over, intimidating at first. But you're a very approachable sort of girl. Oh, I am sure it won't be for long, Hermione said. I am an excellent student, and I always find that being properly prepared solves just about any problem. I've already read the entire third-year history syllabus twice over, though I do wish the translation of Reformation of Northern Magical Order had better footnotes. Emil made a faint strangled sound beside her, as Astrid's brows arched ever so slightly. Twice, she repeated. By the gods, that's impressive. Oh, itis, Hermione asked, scrunching her nose up. She thought Durmstrang had more intellectual rigor than Hogwarts, but it seemed the students here were just as allergic to proper preparation. Most students wait until after the first week to start showing off, said Astrid, smiling wider. Hermione blinked, smiling confusedly. Oh, I am not showing off, she said slowly. I just like to be thorough, really. Of course you do, Astrid murmured, with that same perfectly pleasant tone. Emil, meanwhile, looked as though he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. As they reached the history classroom, a vast, echoing chamber with long desks and banners of faded crimson hanging from the rafters, Astrid's voice turned sugary sweet. "Well, it was lovely to meet you, Hermione. I am sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other." "Oh, I do hope so," Hermione said, radiant. "I think it's so important to make good connections early on, don't you?" Astrid smiled again, that same glinting smile, and glided off toward her own desk only a row ahead. Emil sighed, sinking into his seat. "You really didn't notice, did you?" Hermione frowned. "Notice what?" "Nothing," Emil said quickly, looking pained. "Nothing at all." Hermione shrugged, already rummaging for her quill. "Honestly, Emil, you need to be clearer when you talk. Communication is key to friendship." He dropped his head into his hands. "I am starting to see why Astrid said this term would be interesting." Hermione began arranging her stuff with military precision. Ink, quill, blotter, notes. Astrid and her giggling circle of friends were already whispering behind their hands and throwing the occasional glance backward. Hermione didn't notice. She was busy taking in the room's details, especially the elaborate runes etched into the stone lintel and the peculiar array of unmoving portraits along the side wall, each depicting figures in heavy red robes with fur-lined collars. They were Durmstrang's former headmasters, she realized with a thrill. The door creaked open. Master Iliv strode in with a brisk, confident step, his boots clicking against the floor. He was a man in his late 40s, perhaps, with dark hair streaked faintly with silver and a neat, pointed beard. But unlike the professors Hermione had met so far, stern, cold, and frighteningly formal Gregor Iliv wore an expression that could only be described as cheerful. "Good morning, class," he said brightly, voice echoing across the hall. "Welcome back, my young historians. I trust your summers were productive, full of rest, reading, and no small amount of mischief." A few students laughed softly. Emil looked ready to roll his eyes. Hermione perked up immediately, quill poised. "I see most of you have returned taller," and his eyes twinkled, hopefully wiser. "But we also have Anuface this year, don't we?" His gaze swept the room before landing on Hermione. "Ah, Miss Morgenstern, yes, our guest from Britain." Hermione straightened at once. "Yes, Sir Althwam, not really a guest, since I hope I am here to stay." "Welcome to Durmstrang Institute, then," Iliv said warmly. "I am Master Gregor Iliv, and I have the honor of instructing you all in magical history. You'll find I am rather fond of discussion, so do not hesitate to raise your hand, even especially when you disagree with me." Hermione smiled at that. "I'll remember that, sir." Astrid's shoulders gave the tiniest twitch ahead of her, as if suppressing a laugh. Iliv clasped his hands together. "Excellent. Now, to our first unit of the term, one of my personal favorites. We'll be studying Muggle-wizard relations throughout the centuries, focusing on the shifting balance of power and influence between the magical and non-magical worlds." Hermione's heart gave a little jump of excitement. She loved cross-societal studies, magical or not. Iliv began pacing lightly before the blackboard. "It is easy, from our vantage point in the modern age, to take the statute of secrecy for granted. But for most of history, wizards and muggles lived side by side, cooperating, competing, even intermarrying. Until, of course," he paused dramatically. "The inevitable happened." Hermione's brow furrowed. "Inevitable," she murmured. Iliv smiled. "Ah, yes. For as long as humanity has existed, there has been hierarchy, strength and weakness, power and dependence. And when one group possesses gifts that the other cannot comprehend," his voice dropped slightly, "conflict is not only natural, it is unavoidable." Several students nodded solemnly, as though this were gospel. Hermione hesitated, quill hovering above her parchment. For once, she was unsure if she should be taking notes at all. "Now," Iliv continued, "our first focus will be the 13th century, the height of wizard influence before the separation. Wizards held nearly every key advisory post in the northern courts. Muggle kings, in their wisdom, deferred to magical counsel. But he tapped the board as superstition grew and fear spread. That dynamic changed. And so began the great retreat of wizard kind. Hermione began scribbling notes furiously, but couldn't help but notice the reverence when he said wizard kind, paired with a faint disdain when he said muggles. Illiv went on, voice still warm. We will examine how cooperation between magical and non-magical peoples broke down, how muggles, driven by ignorance and envy, turned upon their betters. Their betters. Hermione's quill stilled for a moment. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. She wasn't exactly fluent in German yet, of course. Of course, he said smoothly, we must always seek to understand, not condemn. But it is important, especially for young wizards and witches, to know their place in the great tapestry of history, to understand what was lost when the bloodlines were diluted, and what might be reclaimed through study, discipline, and pride in one's magical heritage. The room was silent. Several students were nodding again, slow, solemn, approving. Hermione wrote pride in magical heritage in her margins, underlined twice, then frowned at it. Master Illiv beamed at them all as if he hadn't just delivered a veiled sermon. Now then, he said briskly, quills ready. Let's begin with a question. Who can tell me the earliest recorded instance of magical persecution by muggles in the Northern Territories? Half a dozen hands shot up, and Hermione's hand was one of the first to go up. But before Master Illiv could even glance her way, Astrid's hand waved higher, her golden braid glinting in the firelight. Yes, Miss Lindström, Illiv said, clearly pleased. Astrid smiled sweetly, glancing over her shoulder just long enough for Hermione to catch the glint of smugness in her ice-blue eyes. The burning of Lugendorf, Sir 1261. The local Muggle villagers accused the local wizarding family, the Van Albergs, of bringing storm and famine. They burned their manor to the ground, with everyone still inside. Excellent, Miss Lindström, Illiv said approvingly, writing Lugendorf, 1261 across the board in bold, elegant script. One of the earliest mass persecutions in Northern Europe. And note this, everyone what followed was not retaliation. He turned, pacing slowly before the class. The surviving wizarding families did not strike back. They withdrew. They hid. They learned to conceal themselves for their own safety. Thus began the long, slow erosion of magical dominance. Hermione's brow furrowed. Dominance. She murmured softly, mostly to herself, but Illiv's sharp ears caught it. Yes, Miss Morgenstern. She hesitated, every eye turning toward her. Astrid and her friends exchanged tiny smiles. I only meant, so dominance seems like an odd word. Wizards were never truly dominant over muggles, were they? At least not everywhere. I mean, in Britain, there were wizards who chose to live quietly among muggles, helping them healers, alchemists, astrologers helping. Illiv repeated, his tone still genial but faintly patronizing, is one word for it, yes. But as well discuss, such coexistence rarely ends in mutual respect. The magical are envied by the mundane, Miss Morgenstern. Always have been, always will be. Hermione blinked. But surely that's not inevitable. I mean, fear usually comes from misunderstanding education. Can Illiv's smile widened. Education, yes. But whose education? Ours or theirs? The class chuckled softly. Astrid leaned back in her chair, giving Hermione a pitying sort of smile that made her ears burn. Master Illiv continued, undeterred. Miss Morgenstern's point, however, does bring us to an interesting contrast. While the British ministry historically tried to mingle with muggles, the northern schools, Durmstrang chief among them, preserved the old ways. Discipline, caution, strength in tradition. He turned to the board again, tapping a line under the retreat of wizard kind. Remember this, all of you. Every age of concealment begins with an age of betrayal. Illiv then switched topics, lecturing on the wizard councils of the Baltic, his tone brisk and almost theatrical. The councils, according to him, had once maintained order between wizarding clans and the surrounding, ungrateful muggles. They'd organized weather wards to protect their lands, raised magical defenses against invaders, even conducted the cleansing of certain areas for their own protection, Illiv said, smiling benignly. Hermione's notes grew increasingly cramped. Every time Ilive used a word like purity, bloodline, or protection, she felt her stomach tighten. But no one else seemed to react. Emil was dutifully taking notes beside her, brow furrowed in concentration, but utterly calm. When Ilive spoke about the cultural decay that followed when wizards intermarried with muggles, he nodded thoughtfully, as though it were merely an interesting historical theory. Astrid, meanwhile, answered nearly every question with the confident ease of someone raised on the same stories. Her friends looked gleeful each time Ilive praised her, and when he lauded her keen historical awareness, she beamed. Hermione, for all her discomfort, couldn't help being fascinated. There was so much history here, but all of it was told from one deeply slanted view. She wanted to argue with every sentence to show how absurd some of it was, but she couldn't tell if doing so would earn respect or just make her a target. Most likely the latter, Hermione could surmise. So she stayed quiet mostly and wrote furiously instead. When Ilive finally dismissed the class, her hand was cramped and her stomach a little queasy. An excellent start, everyone, Ilive said, beaming. I can see this will be a most promising year. For homework groans echoed lightly around the room. Y'all each write a one-foot summary on the Lugendorf tragedy and reflect on what it teaches us about the dangers of magical complacency. Due Thursday. Off you go. Astrid rose gracefully, brushing her hair back. Idle of Master Ilive's classes, she said to no one in particular, but loudly enough for Hermione to hear. He always makes it so clear how our kind nearly lost everything by being too trusting. Outsiders should always be treated with the utmost of scrutiny, I think. Muggle or witch. She shot a look at Emil then. Emil gave a faint smile. He's good at making history sound alive. Hermione, gathering her parchment, murmured alive, yes. Slightly terrifying, too. Astrid turned to her, beaming. Oh, Hermione, you'll get used to it. I know the English are known for being really soft-hearted, but I am sure you'll shape up in no time. I mean, you're already so brave coming here. I heard you skipped a year even, which is just beautiful. Only 12, and competing with people who are almost 14. Hermione smiled back, genuinely touched. That's kind of you to say, she said earnestly. It was an awfully nerve-wracking decision to make, but I think I did what I felt was best to academically challenge myself. I do hope I am not too behind, but I am sure I can catch up if needed. A laugh pealed from Astrid. Oh, she's just so precious, she cooed, looking at Emil. Make sure to look out for her, yeah. Don't want her cracking under all the pressure. Then she turned back to her friends, who snickered softly as they left. Hermione frowned, confused but pleased nonetheless. Emil just shook his head with a tiny, knowing sigh. You really think she was being nice, don't you? He muttered as they stepped into the corridor. Hermione blinked. Wellies, she seems very kind. Well, I thought addressing only you at the end whilst discussing me was rather rude, but I suppose Scandinavian sensibilities are different. Emil made a helpless sound that might have been a laugh, but if history had left Hermione unsettled, charms completely revived her faith in Durmstrang. Mistress Merle's classroom smelled faintly of ozone and burning parchment, and it looked delightfully like the inside of a mad inventor's workshop. Strange brass instruments lined the walls, each humming faintly with its own tune. On the ceiling, glass spheres floated in lazy orbit, flashing with ripples of blue light every time someone cast even the simplest spell. Mistress Merle herself was a whirlwind of wild white hair, ink-stained fingers, and thick spectacles that made her eyes seem enormous. She greeted them rather irritably, come in, come in, come in already, and immediately set about drawing what looked like the world's most complicated diagram on the blackboard. Ventus, she declared, underlining a symbol shaped like a turning spiral. Our first spell of the year. You all should know it at least from skimming your books over the summer, a simple gust. Harmless, point and blow, yes. No. Hermione sat upright, quill poised, heart already racing with delight. Wind, Merle said, sketching layers of circles and folding lines, is never simple. It is a force without shape, held together by tension and void. And so is this charm a structure of folds, pressure, and directional will. You do not conjure wind, you pull it, thou coax it. You create the conditions under which it must exist. She darted about the room, muttering in Finnish between sharp bursts of German, occasionally snapping her wand at the diagrams to illuminate individual folds in the spell's design. The ancients named air not just an element, but the breath between things' motion, thought, change. This, she tapped the spiral, is its invitation. You are not making wind. You are aligning your will with the nature of air itself, and if your structure falters, it will scatter or worse, turn on you. She rapped the board with her wand. A breeze rustled the pages on every desk. Mistress Merle continued, making them take rigorous notes as she lectured, and Hermione was brimming with joy all the while as her hand began to ache. Then she set them loose. Experiment, she ordered, clapping her hands, but intelligently. And I know that is nigh impossible for many of you, Buttry, for God's sake, and proceeded to stalk around the classroom like a curious predator, snapping whenever a student did something she considered ridiculous. Hermione adored it. She cast the wind charm perfectly only after a few tries, but Merle made her experiment more, until, after over half an hour of furious note-taking and thinking, she managed to add a little counter-clockwise twist and jab that made the wind slightly colder. This made Merle grin slightly, speaking of the excellent invocation of the north wind, before one student blew up their desk, and she whirled on them annoyedly. Hermione left the classroom practically glowing, still muttering spell structure models under her breath. Emil trailed after her, bewildered but amused. "She's something, isn't she?" he said, smiling weakly. "I didn't think Shed let us experiment so early. The first 2 years, she just talked a lot about it. Still, at least she's good at preventing the accidents from getting too bad." But poor Petrovi hope she manages to reattach his Nostra was so much blood, she's brilliant. Hermione replied. None of the course books went as in-depth in the relationship between semantics and magical structure. It's a completely new paradigm of spell theory I've encountered. Do you think she has any good supplementary readings she could offer me? Oh, I'd love that. Emil blinked. Aha. Well, like the floating lights a lot. They're always my favorite part of her classes. Magical dueling and warfare prove to be quite different, though. Master Pascal Rammel was the polar opposite of Mistress Merle. He stood outside of the classroom door like a general, broad-shouldered, severe, with a scar running down one cheek and a voice that could probably shatter glass. Outside, he barked before anyone had even sat down. Wands away. Move. Hermione blinked while Emil groaned quietly. They were herded out to the edge of the lake, where the sun shone brightly, glinting off the black stone path. Rommel paced before them, hands clasped behind his back. "Magic is nothing without stamina," he roared. "You think dueling is about fancy wandwork, about pretty spells. Wrong. You cannot defend if you cannot breathe. You cannot think if your legs fail you. You cannot survive against a stronger enemy if you cannot escape. Now run." There was no spell, no whistle, just that word like thunder. Hermione, along with everyone else, ran instantly. By the time they completed the second lap, Hermione's lungs were on fire, her curls plastered to her forehead. Emil was wheezing beside her, face the color of his scarf. "I thought this was dueling, not marathon training," he gasped. Rommel, of course, looked perfectly unruffled. "Third years," he barked when they staggered back into the courtyard. Inside, "You've wasted enough oxygen, runts." Inside, the classroom was lined with dueling dummies, some scarred, some smoking faintly. Rommel began the lecture. "Magic," he said, pacing between rows, "is not art. It is warfare. Your enemy will not care how well you conjugate your incantations. They will care whether you hit them before they hit you. Magic is strategy. Understand your opponent, control your ground, dominate the field." He began sketching battle diagrams with his wand, lines of light forming shapes in the air. The War of the Baltic Circles, the Lithuanian skirmishes, the Durmstrang aura suppression of 74, these are our case studies this term. Hermione, still half dizzy from the run, took notes furiously all the same. Emil just slumped over his parchment. Rommel swept his gaze over them all. By next week, you will demonstrate a defensive posture that does not embarrass me. If you can't, you will be assigned more laps until you can." Class dismissed. Hermione stumbled out of the room, half dead but strangely exhilarated. Emil looked like he might faint. "Well," he croaked, "if I don't survive this term, tell Astrid she can have my broom." Oh, Godey should've listened to Hersh's taking runes peacefully reading Hermione, who was still thinking over Rommel's light diagram formations in her head, replied absently, "I think he's wonderful." Emil stared. "You think Everyone's wonderful." "Not everyone," Hermione said primly, straightening her bag. "I just don't complain so much." Over the next several days, Hermione learned two things with absolute certainty. First, that Durmstrang's classes were far more rigorous and unflinchingly practical than Hogwarts ever dreamed of, and second, that her personality was not, perhaps, ideally suited to making friends in such an environment. Or in any environment, really. By the second day, she had already corrected 3 students in charms. One of them, a hulking boy who had glared at her for a solid minute afterward, debated the pronunciation of an incantation with a student she had overheard studying in the library, and earned the dubious nickname walking encyclopedia from a group of girls who thought she couldn't understand Velstrian. She couldn't, but Emil could, and she forced him to translate. And an older boy, Luca Litvak, had sent a nasty-seeming curse at her, too, although that wasn't due to her personality, but instead because she had taken too long to walk up the stairs. Thankfully, it had missed. Still, she couldn't help herself. There was just so much to learn, and she wanted to master all of it. Emil, mercifully, didn't seem to mind her endless commentary. He even laughed occasionally, though Hermione wasn't sure whether he was laughing with her or at her. Iva on the other hand, remained an enigma. Hermione had tried everything from polite conversation to asking her opinion on the metaphysical structure of charms. Iva had responded, respectively, with no and perhaps. Hermione wasn't sure if that last one was progress or a fluke. Arithmancy was a very demanding sort of ordeal, Hermione found. Master Raskov, slight and grim with thin, angular features, conducted his class like a military exercise in logic. Enchanted chalk scribbled equation on the blackboard behind him as he lectured. "Magic," he said in a sharp voice, "is measurable probability shaped by will. Every incantation is a variable, every outcome a function of your precision. You cannot rely on chance unless you calculate it first." Hermione adored him, but Raskov did not adore her back. By the third time she raised her hand to clarify a derivation he hadn't finished explaining, he said curtly, "Miss Morgenstern, if you continue anticipating my conclusions, I'll have you teach the class instead, since that is so clearly what you wish to do." Hermione went pink and ducked her head. Emil nearly fell out of his chair, trying not to laugh, until Hermione glared at him. After that, he found his shoes quite interesting too. Natural magic, on the other hand, was another surprise entirely. The classroom was not really a classroom at all. It was a vast glass house that opened directly into the pine forest behind the main keep. The air smelled of resin, damp soil, and something metallic. Master Thalberg looked like a man who lived outdoors more than in. His beard was streaked with grey and pine needles. His fur-lined cloak smelled faintly of smoke and herbs. He had a voice that could rumble like distant thunder and a habit of staring at students for several seconds before answering their questions, as if testing whether the question was worthy of a reply. "Magic," he said, laying a hand on a pot of writhing vines, "is not just will, it is harmony. The balance between man and the living world. Disrupt that balance and you lose power. Respect it and even the stones will listen." Hermione nodded furiously, scribbling every word. Then he added, "Or perhaps they won't. It depends on the stone." She frowned. That didn't really sound like a sound law at all. That's not very scientific, so Thalberg only smiled faintly, stirring a bubbling cauldron. "Nor is lightning." Well, that just isn't true, Hermione thought privately, pursing her lips. The students were paired for the term to work on alchemical studies, mixing potions, cultivating magical flora, occasionally feeding something in a cage that might have been breathing fire. When Astrid was assigned as Hermione's partner, she clasped her hands together and exclaimed, "Oh, how wonderful!" in a tone so sparkling that Hermione nearly glowed with relief. Finally, someone friendly. But Astrid's friendliness turned out to mean a lot of giggling, an astonishing ability to delegate all the dirty work. "You're just so good at slicing roots evenly, Hermione," and a habit of chatting about Lars whenever Hermione tried to discuss transmutation ratios. During the class, Hermione was quite sure she had learned more about Lars, more than anyone not his parents should know. How had Astrid known about all of his birthmarks? Than anything about the Earth's inherent magic. Still, Hermione tried to stay positive. After all, cooperation was an important part of education, even if Astrid spent half the class braiding her own hair. But rituals was perhaps the worst of them all. The classroom was dim, the floor covered in chalk circles and star diagrams that had clearly not been redrawn in years. The professor, an elderly wizard named Master Vaughn, looked like he'd been dragged there under duress. He gave the impression of a man perpetually 5 minutes from retiring. "Circles," he said flatly, waving a hand at the floor. "Squares, triangles, they are shapes. They all do something. You'll find out what eventually, I hope. Read chapter 2. Or no, it's the first day of this class for this section, isn't it? Chapter 1, then." And then there was dark magic. Hermione had dreaded the class since the moment she saw Professor Dusha Varrick's name on her timetable. She was certain, absolutely certain, that Varrick knew. She had been the one who came to fetch Hermione from her home, and that flicker of recognition on her face, Hermione could still feel it. Yet when the lesson began, Varrick was simply pleasantly smiling. "Dark magic," she said, "is not evil. Nor is it good. It is power that requires intention. Like fire, it burns where it is aimed. A fool blames the flame for the house he sets alight." She flicked her wand, and a pattern of shapes appeared in the air, geometric and jagged, the form of a spell that looked almost alive. "Today," she continued, "we study Themedening spell. It is simple energy of dissonance, meant to disorient the mind, not destroy it. Used by soldiers to break lines. You will not cast it yet. Theory first. Always theory first." And she stuck by that. They only discussed its structure, the precision required to ensure it unraveled only thought patterns, not the mind itself. Hermione took meticulous notes, even as her skin prickled at every mention of psychic interference. Finally, Thursday arrived. Transfiguration Master Capel's class was the last on her schedule, and she approached it with both anticipation and dread. Capel was the kind of man who could silence a room just by standing in it. Tall, hawk-eyed, and perfectly poised, he had a presence like polished steel. His gaze flicked across the class like a blade. It lingered briefly and not favorably on Emil, who slouched slightly beside Hermione. "If you cannot discipline your body, Mr. Novak," Capel said sharply, "you cannot discipline your will. And transfiguration demands both, boy." Capel turned from the blackboard with a motion so precise it was almost mechanical, his black robes sweeping sharply behind him. He strode to the front of the classroom, clasping his hands behind his back. "For your practical demonstration," he said, voice cool and clipped, "you will attempt to transfigure." He paused, letting the tension stretch. Emil beside Hermione stiffened, as if bracing for bad news. Air itself. There was a beat of utter silence, the face of each student tiredly drawn, as if they knew that you will bring life from the intangible. From nothing. Hermione blinked, certain she'd misheard. "Sir," she began, raising her hand hesitantly, "if I might clarify, you mean, were to make something living from thin air." But that would require mass," said Capel, arching a brow. "Form. Intent. Yes, Miss Morgenstern, I am aware of what it requires." Hermione shut her mouth. "You are not expected to succeed," Capel went on, pacing before the class, only totemed. "All of you will fail, most likely. You will misunderstand, overreach, or produce something abominable. That is acceptable. It is in failure that transfiguration reveals your limits, and in understanding those limits that you may, one day, surpass them." He stopped, snapping his fingers once. The air in the room shimmered faintly, as though charged with unseen energy. Begin. Hermione immediately opened her textbook only to find, as she suspected, nothing. Each chapter only covered inanimate to animate solid transformations. Nothing about turning air analement into a creature. That's impossible, Emil muttered beside her, already sweating. How do you even shape air? It's not impossible, Hermione said automatically, though her voice wobbled. It's just advanced. If we think of air as matter in a dispersed state, and we can manipulate its essence, Emil said flatly. Then theoretically, oh hush, I am thinking. She closed her eyes, picturing the molecules swirling invisibly around her. If matter was just condensed energy, and transfiguration bent the laws of conservation through will alone, then perhaps she could pull that energy tighter, reshape it, and compress it into being something like a lynx. The German word for air, Luft, sounded a little like the word for lynx. Luch, but no, the difference in mass would be too large. Her wand trembled slightly as she lifted it. There was a faint whooshing sound. Then a small puff of air hit her in the face and nothing else happened. She groaned. Around the room, similar sounds of failure echoed. Pops, faint hisses, a faint squeal as Ivan Petrov's desk exploded. Capel said nothing, his hands clasped behind his back, walking between desks like an executioner assessing his work. And then, sir, said a calm voice near the back. Hermione turned. It was a tall, sharp-featured boy who had spoken. Conrad von Eisenwald, Hermione knew. He was a quiet, but altogether a good student who even had quite a few friends, from what Hermione had surmised. Still, he rarely spoke in class or raised his hand. Now he sat perfectly still, his expression serene, wand poised between long fingers. His hair, pale and neatly combed, gleamed faintly in the lamplight. His wand moved rapidly, as he seemed to be deep into the process of transfiguring something. The air above his desk was slowly thickening and coalescing into something with form, substance, life. Then at once there was a loud pop, and a small little bee took shape. It buzzed, flitted once around Conrad's head, and landed lightly on his shoulder. Capel's expression didn't soften, but his eyes gleamed. He approached slowly, inspecting the creature. The bee buzzed louder, as if acknowledging him. Perfect structure, he murmured. Solid, breathing, stable essence. Remarkable control, as usual. He straightened, turning to the rest of the class. Observe closely. What Mr. von Eisenwald has achieved is what true transformation is. The essence of life drawn from the potential within all things. Hermione simply stared, utterly transfixed. The bee Wazelive, truly alive. Capel's gaze swept over the rest of them, cool and cutting once more. You will all study the principles demonstrated here. And you will all fail less spectacularly in due time. That may take until graduation. He turned away, dismissing them with a flick of his wand. The bell rang. As the class began to pack up, Hermione leaned toward Emil, whispering in awe, he made life out of air. Emil groaned. I made wind out of air. Well, that was from all that furious flapping you were doing, I suspect. The bee's buzz still could be heard from across the room, and Hermione couldn't help but glance back just once at Conrad von Eisenwald. Chapter 7. Capel Knows Best. The library was quieter than usual that evening, if such a place ever could be. The floating ladders hummed softly to themselves as they drifted through the aisles, carrying stacks of heavy tomes from shelf to shelf. A few books flapped overhead like restless owls, the occasional whisper of parchment, wings punctuating the scratch of quills. Hermione sat at a corner table, a fortress of textbooks and parchment towers rising around her. The open pages off transfigurative continuums. Theory and practice glowed faintly, illuminated by the dancing, diamond-bright lights trapped within the lamps sat on the desk. She had been staring at the same paragraph for nearly 10 minutes. He didn't even say an incantation, she muttered, tapping her quill against her notes. Not one. Just a flick of his wrist so controlled and had created something. Not conjured, but created. With magic, we all know. Across from her, Emil was slouched low in his chair, rolling his quill between his fingers and looking like he'd sooner transfigure himself into a pillow. "You're still on that," he said, stifling a yawn. "Hermione, it's just Conrad. Just Conrad," Hermione repeated, scandalized. He performed a feat of transfigurative magic that shouldn't possible for any third year, and you're saying it's just Conrad. In charms, he wasn't even the first to cast the wind charm properly, it was. "Yeah," Emil said, flipping idly through his history notes. "That's kind of his thing. Being better than everyone. Just because it isn't obvious all the time doesn't mean it isn't true." Hermione blinked at him. "Better? As in what? In transfiguration?" "In everything," Emil said flatly. "Transfiguration's just where he really shows off. He's been at the top of the rankings since first year. And second, and well, you get the idea." Hermione frowned. "Rankings. Durmstrang keeps skill rankings," Emil explained. "They're A for each subject and posted bi-weekly. Master Capel especially loves talking about them. I think he likes rubbing it in my face about how I am always near the bottom for transfiguration. And there's one class ranking posted at the end of the year where we're given our overall runic mark. Pathetic students are given essays. Passable, the majority are given answers. Those above the rest, but not the best, are given jura. And for the top of the class, Tiwazi's awarded. Technically, there's one more Othala, but that's reserved for, like, legacy-worthy stuff. Grindel got that mark in his second year here. Anyway, though, I hate the rankings. It's like public humiliation. Our first year, Astrid Gota says, and she was bullied to tears about it. It's supposed to encourage healthy competition, but that really just means making sure everyone knows exactly how far below someone like Conrad they are. That's ghastly, Hermione said, appalled. Competition isn't the point of education. Try telling them that, Emil said, smirking a little. Anyway, he's different, comes from an old Prussian magical line, the Eisenwalds. Used to be nobility before the Confederation unified the Germanic states. His family still acts like it matters, though. He mimed a stiff bow, nose in the air. "Hello, gracious miss. I am Herr von Eisenwald, but you can also call me better than you." Hermione cracked a reluctant smile, but her eyes were still thoughtful. "He didn't seem smug," she said softly. "More detached. Like he was doing something perfectly ordinary when it was anything but." "That's exactly why everyone likes him," Emil said, shrugging. "He doesn't ever rub it in that he's better. He just is." Hermione sighed and dropped her quill, staring blankly at a half-finished arithmancy chart. "I don't understand how someone can be that good at everything. It's like he's living pureblood propaganda." "Careful," Emil said dryly, though not unkindly. "You sound like a proper Durmstrang scholar now. I thought you were all about being the Muggle crusader in history class." Hermione flushed, realizing how that had sounded. "Oh no, that's not what Iwell. I just mean it's infuriating." "Welcome to the club," Emil said, grinning now. "We meet here every week. Mottos. Conrad ruins the grading curve for everyone." Hermione huffed but smiled despite herself. She picked up her quill again, though her mind refused to settle back into her arithmancy equations. The memory of the small bee lingered in her head like a radio hit she couldn't forget. "Still," she murmured, almost to herself, "to create something truly alive from air. It must mean he understands something the rest of us don't." "Yeah," Emil said around a mouthful of bite-sized chocolates he smuggled in. "Like how not to care about sleep, or the rules of magic, it seems." A passing ladder made a sound that could only be described as a disapproving clank. Hermione glared up at it. "Don't you start again," she warned it. The ladder sniffed somehow and drifted away in offense. Emil laughed. "You really do make enemies everywhere, huh?" "Not enemies," Hermione said primly, straightening her parchment stack. "Just spirited acquaintances." Saturday dawned gray and cool, with fog curling low across the mountain lake. The air that slipped through the cracks of the north tower window carried the faint scent of pine. Hermione sat cross-legged on her bed, parchment spread out in front of her, her quill tapping anxiously against her lip. It was her first weekend at Durmstrang, and instead of taking the morning to rest, or, as Emil had suggested, finally sleep like a sane person, she was drafting a letter. Not just an letter, but one that required precision, restraint, and the creativity of a seasoned liar. Her parents couldn't know where she really was. They couldn't know what Durmstrang even was. So as far as Mr. and Mrs. Granger of Hampstead Garden Suburb were concerned, their daughter was attending Schloss Falkenstein Internat. And so, Hermione had to write all about this fake school. Given she did not feel comfortable lying about everything, she decided to tell the truth, just changing it as she saw fit. Her pen scratched carefully across the paper, because she didn't dare use quill or parchment for this. Dear Mum and Dad, I hope you're both doing well. The first week has been rather overwhelming, but fascinating too. The teachers here are all brilliant, if a bit strict. You'd like Master Raskov, he's the mathematics professor. He reminds me a little of Professor McGonagall, except if Shed decided to specialize in algebra and probability theory. He insists on perfection in every equation. I like him, but I don't think the feeling is mutual just yet. We've already started physical education, and it's dreadful, honestly. We had to run laps around the lake right after lunch. I've discovered that my speed and endurance is roughly equivalent to that of a sloth, a small, asthmatic sloth. The rest of the subjects are going well, though. Natural sciences is fascinating, even if the professor is very cryptic. He talks about the interconnectedness of all life, as though we're in a philosophy seminar instead of a lab. I keep wanting to take notes, but I am never sure what to write. Oh, and my elective course, design and technology, is just going brilliant too. Mistress Merle is an amazing teacher, if a little scatter-brained and irritable at points. My roommate, Iva, is very quiet but seems nice enough, if a bit distant. Everyone here is very disciplined. Sometimes I think a smile might get one detention. Oh, and the food. Well, let's just say it's not quite as nice as your shepherd's pie, Mum. I am learning to appreciate jam on everything, even bread that crunches like old toast. I'll write again soon. Love you both dearly. Love. Hermione. Hermione read it over 3 times, biting her lip. It sounded normal. A little bland, but Hermione would get better at this, eventually. Soon enough, she'd be sending 5-page-long behemoths like she had while in Hogwarts. But the tricky part wasn't writing the letter. It was sending it. There was an owl perched on the edge of the dormitory's high window, a sleek black creature with amber eyes that glinted like gold. It gave a short, expectant hoot when she turned toward it. She had gotten it from the owlery. I can't send Yowderic Clito them, Hermione said under her breath. They're muggles. You'd frighten them half to death if you landed on the garden fence. The owl blinked slowly, unimpressed. Thankfully, Hermione went on, I've already figured it out. She gave a small, satisfied nod, rummaging through her trunk until she pulled out a sealed parchment envelope, stamped with red wax, the mark of the Continental Postal Liaison Office. Durmstrang didn't advertise its connection to the Muggle postal system, but there were references in the student guide, footnotes, about approved magical couriers who could deliver to wizarding enclaves and then route letters through Muggle channels, properly sealed and glamoured. She had spent half of Friday evening in the library, piecing together the bureaucratic labyrinth of magical mail systems. It turned out that there was already an established system for mixed correspondence, despite the lack of Muggle-borns in Durmstrang. Owls would take those letters and drop them at intermediary stations, where they would be sent off as ordinary pieces of post. It wasn't foolproof, but it was clever enough, Hermione supposed. She slipped her letter into the envelope, carefully inscribed and Mrs. Granger, 54 Ferry Row, Hampstead Garden Suburb, London, in her neatest handwriting, then attached it to the owl's leg. There, she said softly. To the liaison office first, please, not directly to the Muggles. The owl clicked its beak, as if to say, I know what I am doing, and took off through the window in a blur of feathers and cold air. Hermione watched until it disappeared into the mist above the lake. For a long moment, she sat there, rubbing her fingers together. There was a strange pang in her chest. Back at Hogwarts, Shed always felt a little out of place, too studious, too eager to her. But here, she didn't just feel out of place. She felt unknown, because she was a liar. So Hermione said eventually, standing up and looking up at Iva, who was reading the dark magic textbook in bed. Do ya want to perhaps go to the library with me? I have this book I am planning on translating, and I don't know whether you know how to identify runic languages. But no, said Iva from her bed. Hermione politely nodded and smiled, going out of the dorm into the library herself. Once she reached there, she took a moment to admire the cavernous space. It was quite empty in the early morning of Saturday, but Hermione couldn't imagine why, given the sheer amount of homework she had been assigned. She made straight for the corner table near the northern wall, where Shed spotted Emil and Astrid work before. Emil was half-slumped over a dark arts essay, ink smudged on his fingers and the beginnings of a headache creasing his brow. Astrid, by contrast, was the picture of practiced ease, her hair braided neatly and her quill poised over elegant notes that might as well have been calligraphy. Hermione clutched the old, cracked leather book to her chest as she approached. It was the one Shed found earlier in the week, the one the enchanted ladder had insisted take down. She hadn't yet managed to translate a single word of it. Astrid, Hermione began, hesitating by the edge of the table. You're taking ancient runes, right? Astrid looked up slowly, one eyebrow arched. I am, she said, in that faintly sing-song northern lilt. Why? Hermione laid the book down carefully and opened it to one of the more legible pages, dense, with curling characters that looked half like runes, half like tangled vines. I was wondering if you could help me identify this. It doesn't match the Elder Futhark alphabet, but I thought it might have runic roots. Astrid leaned in, peering at the page. For a moment, she was silent. Then, with a small, breathy laugh, she sat back in her chair. Oh, come now, she said. I've been in runes for a week. You think I could identify this? She gestured at the page. You're giving me far too much credit, Hermione. Hermione flushed slightly. Oh. I didn't mean, I just thought maybe you'd recognize the family of the symbols or something. Emil glanced up from his essay, eyes flicking between them. Astrid, he said, stop pretending you don't want to show off. Astrid made a face but sighed theatrically. Fine. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume embossed with silver rune and Ihe Ursprung, the official Durmstrang textbook. Here, I'll lend you the beginner's lexicon. Just don't tell Mistress Thorson. She'd probably have my hide if she knew I was letting a non-runist use it. Hermione's eyes widened. Oh, thank you. I'll be careful, I promise. I need to know what it says. Astrid beamed. Well, try all you like. It'd ask you why you need to translate some dusty old book so badly on a weekend, but well, that's sort of self-explanatory, I suppose. Hermione sat down beside Emil, opening both books eagerly. He gave her a faint, knowing smile, half admiration, half pity. You really don't rest, do you? He murmured. Hermione didn't even look up, not when there's something I don't understand. And it did promise that ladder that it'd get through this. I think I am growing quite tired of lies. He chuckled quietly and leaned back, watching her trace the characters with her fingertip under the golden light streaming in from the lofty windows. After a while, nearly an hour, Emil was practically half asleep atop his S, even though it was morning still, and Astrid was filling in arithmancy charts for homework, but Hermione was on the precipice of a breakthrough. Her brow furrowed in concentration, she flipped rapidly between Astrid's-Runnen and Ihe Ursprungen, the mysterious tome from the ladder, cross-referencing every curve and line. There, she whispered, eyes lighting up. Emil looked over, bleary-eyed. What? This one. She jabbed at a page in Astrid's textbook, then turned the ancient book toward him. Look here, the Fihrun, the Proto-Germanic symbol for cattle and wealth. But in this book, it's twisted, see? Almost mirrored, but the underlying structure is the same. The same formative stems, just reoriented. Astrid glanced over, mildly interested now that Hermione had raised her voice. That does look like an early dialect. Maybe pre-migration era, before the Elder Futhok was standardized. Hermione's eyes sparkled. Exactly, which means this text isn't modern at all, it's practically prehistoric. Look at this one, it's a composite rune. Here, Alga's bound with answers, protection merged with divine inspiration. She broke off, breath quickening. So that would make it quite an early text, right, Astrid? It's not Anglo-Saxon, I think, judging off of those alphabets I saw in Astrid's book here. The strokes are too angular and primitive, for lack of a better word. And this binding technique, see the overlap. That looks like it only appears in the North Sea or early Gothic variant alphabets. Not anywhere else in this book. Astrid leaned back in her chair, twirling her quill idly. Riveting. Hermione noticed the sarcasm, but didn't mind. She was already flipping through several more pages, cross-referencing letters against the neat charts in Astrid's book. No, but look, this makes sense. It looks consistent across the whole page. The phonetics align roughly with the earliest rune rows used by the Nordic tribes before contact with the Saxons. I'd wager this isn't even proper runic, it's a transitional form, something between Proto-Germanic and early Norse. Emil glanced at the symbols, squinting. So it's old, then. Hermione gave a small, distracted nod. Very old. Probably older than Durmstrang itself, which she caught herself before launching into another tangent, pressing her lips together. Anyway, that explains why it's not in Astrid's primer. It's not a language anyone uses anymore. Astrid shrugged, smiling. Well, you've narrowed it down more than I could. Great job. Hermione beamed at her, pleased beyond measure. Thanks, Astrid. I think if I can just match the syntax, or what passes for syntax here, I might be able to get a rough transliteration. Good luck with that, then. Thank you, Hermione said earnestly, already bent back over the pages, scribbling notes furiously as shimmering spell lights flickered across the table. Hours slipped by unnoticed, but Hermione barely felt the time pass. Her parchment was a battlefield of ink scraps of half-legible transliterations, tentative phonetic notes, diagrams of rune clusters that might have meant binding or summoning or sky. Occasionally, she muttered something to herself, her voice no more than a rustle among the turning pages. Astrid eventually rose, stretching with feline grace. Well, I am done for the day, she said, sliding her notes into her bag. I'd like to use my afternoon to relax. I have actual friends, after all. Hermione looked up, blinking owlishly. Oh yes, of course. I just need to finish cross-referencing this section. Astrid gave a bright smile and drifted away, calling a goodbye to Emil as she went. Emil lingered another 10 minutes, chin propped on his hand as he watched Hermione's quill dart and pause and dart again. When it became clear she wasn't going to stop any time soon, he sighed. You'll be here all day, won't you? Hermione glanced up, distracted. I might but don't wait for me. I'll still be there at dinner, of course. Right, he said, not believing that for a moment. Still, he gave a small grin. Don't curse the book into giving up its secrets, yeah. I am not that bad, she said, already turning back to the parchment. By the time she finally closed the book, her fingers were smudged with ink and her back ached from hunching over the desk. But her mind was alive. Shed made progress slow, imperfect, but progress nonetheless. The symbols were starting to make sense. The magic within did not seem very impressive. It was ancient and outdated, really, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that Hermione could read it now. And yet, as she packed up her things, the runes faded from her thoughts, replaced by something else. By him, Conrad von Eisenwald, the image of him from earlier that week, standing calm and unruffled as his wand had carved life from nothing, burned in her mind. The air itself had thickened, coalesced, forming something that moved and breathed and looked back at him. It had been effortless. Hermione's jaw tightened. She had read the entire Transfiguration textbook twice before term even began, and there had been a thing in it like that. No mention of transmuting air into a living creature, or even of generating mass ex nihilo. It shouldn't be possible, not for a student at least. So how had he done it? Her satchel still slung over her shoulder, Hermione slipped through the dim halls. The air was cool and faintly metallic, carrying the distant hum of magic that seemed to live in Durmstrang's very stones. She didn't go to her dormitory, though. Instead, she turned down a side corridor, lit by the flickering glow of a single enchanted torch, and stopped before a heavy oak door embossed with runic sigils of warding and order. Master Capel's office. Hermione hesitated only briefly before knocking. She needed to know how Conrad had done it, and more importantly, if she could. Master Capel did not immediately invite her in. When the door finally opened, it did so with a smooth, deliberate motion, revealing the Transfiguration professor seated at his desk, an expanse of ancient wood meticulously organized, except for a single metal orb, which seemed perpetually in flux. He didn't look surprised to see her. If anything, mildly inconvenienced. Miss Morgenstern, he said slowly, it is a weekend. Hermione clasped her hands together, trying not to fidget. I am sorry, Master Capel. There was something I couldn't stop thinking about the first lesson. He raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly. The lesson, or Van Eisenwald's performance. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Both, she admitted. A faint smirk ghosted across his lips, not quite kind, but not cruel either. I thought as much. Sit. She obeyed instantly, plopping down. The chair opposite his desk was hard and straight-backed, seemingly designed for discomfort. Capel folded his hands. You wish to know how he did it? Hermione nodded. Yes, sir. I've read the entire textbook twice and even gone through supplemental texts from your bibliography, but none of them mention creating life or even matter from air. Of course not, Capel said softly, because it cannot be taught. Not truly. It must be understood. He studied her for a long moment, eyes narrowing faintly. Tell me, Miss Morgenstern, do you believe yourself capable of rivaling Van Eisenwald? Hermione flushed scarlet. I don't think it's about rivalry, sir. I just want to understand. That earned her a short, clipped chuckle, a safe answer, but naive. In Durmstrang, Miss Morgenstern, understanding is a weapon like any other, and those who wield it best rule over those who do not. Van Eisenwald is me finest student. His aptitude borders on the innate. Hermione's chest tightened. So you think I can't do it? I think, Capel said, his tone shifting toward something almost reflective, that you may not yet grasp what it is you are attempting to do. But I also think it would be a waste to tell you to stop trying. So let us discuss some philosophy then. You are familiar with Theta causes, yes? She nodded, almost eagerly. Material, formal, efficient, and final. Good. He steepled his fingers. To transfigure is to act upon all four at once, to manipulate substance in a way that satisfies not merely the physical transformation, but the metaphysical truth of what the object is. Now, he went on, there is also the matter off from the capital kind, the platonic kind, the perfect ideal of everything that exists. Every bird, every chair, every flame is but an imitation, a shadow of that form in the ideal realm. Transfiguration, when done properly, draws upon that perfection. It calls Theta down into the world and impresses it upon matter. Hermione nodded along, already knowing this. But remember, he continued, each thing also has a lower case form, its particular organization of matter, the pattern that makes air airy or stone stony. Matter is potential, form gives that potential structure. He stood, pacing slowly around his desk. Now, Miss Morgenstern, tell me, what is thematter and form of air? Hermione hesitated. The form gives it its lightness, its movement, its warmth. Good, and its matter, she frowned. It's the substance beneath, isn't it? Invisible, but still something. Something that could be anything if it were given another form. Capel's lips twitched upward just slightly. Exactly. So, when you transfigure air, you are not creating matter. You are persuading the existing matter to accept a new form. The wand, the will, and the word trace a boundary through the indefinite. What was shapeless becomes determinate. What was mere potential becomes actual. Hermione bit her lip. So if air's matter is pure potential, and its form grants it freedom, that must be why it's technically mutable but resists fixation. Because the wizard needs to give it form first. Capel nodded once. When we transfigure a solid object, a goblet, into a rat, for example, the scope of our magic is defined by the object's boundaries. The goblet itself tells our magic where it ends. The form is complete, finite. But when you transfigure air, there are no boundaries. You must define them yourself. That is the essence of a partial transfiguration, an incomplete transformation performed deliberately. A mistake done on purpose. And the mass, Hermione asked breathlessly. Surely that matters. He allowed himself a quiet laugh. Erdoshave weight, though not much. Yet the trick is not in conjuring mass from nowhere, it is in convincing the magic that the weight it needs already exists. Similarity, again, eases that path, but even differences can be bridged. Not easily, not safely, but they can. Hermione's heart raced. So then the real difficulty isn't creating life, it's controlling the limits of the transformation. Precisely. She looked up at him then, eyes wide, voice barely above a whisper. And you think I could learn that? Capel regarded her for a long, measuring moment. I don't know, he said finally. You don't seem like a complete half-wit, so perhaps you have the mind for it, although I very much doubt it. The hunger toy doubted even more, if that is possible. Hermione's pulse quickened. Then prove it. He gave a faint smile, thin but not unkind. You are free to try, Miss Morgenstern. Just remember, those who chase perfection must be prepared to be devoured by it. And with that, he dismissed her with a flick of his hand, returning to his papers as if their conversation had been nothing more than a passing digression. But Hermione hesitated before rising. Master Capel. He looked up, quill poised midair. Yes, if I wanted to go deeper into the theory, she began, past what's covered in the coursebook, is there a text you'd recommend? Something that goes into the real structure of it, the composition and mechanics. Capel regarded her with that same sharp, dissecting calm that made lesser students shrink. Then, without a word, he rose and crossed to one of the high shelves lining the wall behind his desk. His office was immaculate, each spine perfectly aligned, each title gilded in some austere script. His finger traced along one shelf until it stopped at a heavy tome that looked quite pristine. He pulled it free with care, setting it on the desk before her with a sound like stone against stone. The Theory of Substances, he said, as though naming a sacred text, by Petrus the Rigorist. 18th century Durmstrang scholar. He catalogued the intrinsic properties of nearly every known material substance, solid, liquid, and gaseous, and their magical compatibilities. It remains the most comprehensive study of inanimate transformation ever written. Hermione reached out, reverently brushing a hand over the cracked spine. The leather was cold and dry. It's incredible, she murmured. Thank you, sir. Her eyes flicked down the table of contents, widening at the sheer scale of it: ash, birch, oak, iron, tin, mercury, silver, silk, linen, glass, smoke, vaporous essences, rare spot. As she skimmed, something struck her. No mention of creatures. No flesh, no feather, no blood. She looked up again. There's nothing on animals, or on living materials at all. Capel's brow arched slightly, as if Shed asked why water was wet. Of course not. Petrus dealt with the stable and the simple. Living matter belongs to a different order of study entirely. Animate forms are infinitely more complex. Their substances are interdependent, constantly in motion, and cannot be defined so easily. Hermione frowned, hugging the weighty volume to her chest. But if I want to study transfiguring air into something living, then start with air, he interrupted. Anyone who cannot first master the theory of inanimate matter has no business attempting to awaken life from it. Hermione blinked, slightly chastened. Yes, sir. He gave a faint, dismissive nod. Good. Study that book. Understand the essence of your materials. When you can make stone breathe or silk hum, and I mean properly, not that tosh I am forced to accept as passable work, you may ask me again about the principles of life. Hermione stood, clutching the massive tome as though it were a treasure chest. Thank you, Master Capel. I'll do my best. I expect nothing less, Miss Morgenstern, he said, already turning back to his papers. Of course, it most likely won't be good enough. Now leave, I beg of you. Chapter 8. Seeing and Listening. September conquered Durmstrang Institute quite decisively, the cheery sunlight appearing less and less frequently until grey fog seemed a permanent fixture. At this point, days at Durmstrang began to blend together into something like rhythm. Hermione rose early every morning, her routine a near military sequence: wake, dress, read, breakfast, class, study, repeat. The novelty of fortress life had long since faded, leaving behind the quiet rigor of her determination. The students of Durmstrang were not a very friendly sort, Hermione had known, but it seemed, with each passing day, that judgment was perhaps a bit too mild. It seemed that all that mattered in Durmstrang was power, whether social or magical. Bullying was quite rampant, unchecked by both faculty and fellow students, and Hermione had even seen a diminutive fifth-year girl hexing a hulking boy silly in a crowded corridor while nobody intervened at all. "Oh, stop it," Hermione had cried out, wringing her hands and stepping up. Before the irate witch could turn on her as well, though, Emil had grabbed her hand and pulled them into the throng. Thankfully, Hermione herself was not a victim of such violence, which was surprising given at least half of her yearmates had been lectured by her at this point. It's explicitly forbidden to use fire to warm yourself. Extinguo. Oh, honestly, with those wand movements, I think you were trying to create a new spell. Did you even hear Master Thalberg's safety lecture, or were you too busy sword fighting with your wands? According to Emil, this was because students who were good at magic were generally not targeted. In a world where SWATness aided one's ability to warp the fabric of reality itself, he said many considered it unwise to do so. Academically, she was thriving, or as close to thriving as one could be in such a school. Even Master Capel, who seldom praised any, had once remarked that her thimble-to-ant transformation attempt was not quite as pathetic as most of the other students. But dueling was another matter entirely. Hermione could memorize the sequence of wand movements, could quote the precise timing and counter-angles by heart, but put her in an actual sparring match, and everything fell apart in a matter of seconds. Her reflexes were poor. She hesitated before casting offensive spells, and she felt awful sending jinxes and hexes at her opponents. Emil wasn't much better. He tripped over his own feet twice during the last exercise and once accidentally disarmed himself. And the laps Rommel made them take around the castle. Well, Hermione would prefer not to talk about those. Especially the run on that one day she had decided to try meat jelly for lunch after Emil's urging still. Hermione made up for it in the classroom portions. There, amid Master Rommel's lectures on combat theory, strategy, and spell patterning, she was in her element. She devoured every word about spell dynamics and psychological warfare, eagerly cross-referencing it with her notes from dark arts and history. Emil spent most of those sessions doodling miniature stick wizards dueling in the margins of his parchment, but Hermione filled entire pages with diagrams and footnotes. Only one class still made her skin crawl. Mistress Varick's lessons on the dark arts were deceptively civil, Hermione felt. The professor carried herself with the serene but somewhat stiff poise of someone perpetually hosting a tea party. Yet something about her still made Hermione's stomach knot. Perhaps it was the fact Varick had bewitched her mother, or simply that Varick knew of her true heritage. Yet if Varick did, there was no hint, just the slow, careful study of theory. The dark arts, Varick often reminded, are no different from fire. It is not evil to strike a match, but foolishness to play with it before understanding what it burns. Hermione clung to that distinction, though her unease never quite left her. But Varick seemed to be quite fond of her, for whatever reason, and found no reason to call on Hermione in particular. She had even proudly shown the rest of the class Hermione's essay on the mechanisms of how power of both the moon and the element of air itself were summoned as the inherent basis of all mental manipulation spells. Outside of class, her world was books. She spent long evenings poring over the theory of substances, the heavy tome Master Capel had lent her. Its dense text charted the intrinsic magical compatibilities of all known substances, how iron resisted enchantment, how silver enhanced purity, how air itself responded to intent and containment. Hermione annotated every page, determined to understand how Conrad von Eisenwald had accomplished the impossible in their first transfiguration lesson. When not drowning in Capel's treatise, she was working on the translation of the runic book the library ladder had all but forced her to borrow. That one was proving slower going. The text, written in some archaic northern dialect, seemed to chronicle a cabal of ancient wizards trying to codify the relationship between symbols and magical effect, why certain ones worked, and others fizzled into nothing. Their magic, from what Hermione could tell, was crude, experimental, almost desperate. Spells that took hours to cast, rituals that demanded entire covens. She had rolled her eyes more than once at instructions like, if the storm refuses to answer, sacrifice another goat. Still primitive or not, Hermione found herself oddly fascinated. The book wasn't about spells that worked. It was about the Logikov trying. About how human beings reached for magic before they understood it. So she carried on translating, eyes stinging from spell light, ink smudged on her fingers. And then, on a rare afternoon when her quill hand ached and her brain hummed with equations, Emil finally appeared at her table in the library, leaning against the chair with that familiar half-smile. "Put the book down," he said. Hermione blinked, not looking up. "I can't. I'm just reaching a section where they're testing the differing sigil arrays, and no." Emil plucked the quill from her fingers. "You're coming with me," she frowned. "Why?" he grinned. "Because it's the weekend, Hermione, and I'm going to show you something better than dusty air and bad lighting." Hermione hesitated. She looked longingly at her books, then sighed. "Fine," she said, gathering her notes. "But only for half an hour." "Perfect," Emil said, already heading for the door. "That's how long it takes to get there." Hermione groaned, realizing she'd just been tricked. She followed him nonetheless. Emil led the way out of the main fortress, past the gates that groaned under their own weight, and onto the narrow path that cut along the cliffs. The wind off the lake hit them immediately. "Honestly, Emil," Hermione huffed, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders as the wind tried to steal it. "If this is another one of your attempts at fresh air, I swear, it's not," he said, voice light, not even turning back. His boots crunched against the gravel, sure-footed and irritatingly casual. "Because the last time you said that," she went on, "we ended up on the East Parapet Fortwo hours, and I nearly froze solid while you tried to see the wind currents." Emil laughed, the sound carried off immediately by the breeze. "You're dramatic, you know that." "I'm sensible," Hermione snapped, stumbling slightly on the uneven path. "There's a difference." He offered her a hand without looking, just extending it behind him. Hermione glared at it for a second before taking it, muttering something about reckless boys. The cliffs were steeper here, the path winding down in tight switchbacks that forced them single file. Below, the lake looked quite calm and placid, but Hermione got a glimpse of large, dark figures flitting under the surface. To their right stretched the mountains, their jagged peaks layered in shadow and distance and pale blue where the light caught them. Hermione tried not to look impressed. "So," she said after a while, her breath fogging in front of her, "where exactly are you dragging me? It had better be something worthwhile if I'm risking a broken neck." "You'll see," said Emil. "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." Hermione scowled. If this turns out to be some sort of Durmstrang initiation prank, Emil finally glanced over his shoulder, smiling. "Would I do that?" "Yes," he laughed again, unoffended. "You know, I'm too scared of you to do that." After several minutes of careful descent, they finally reached the base of the cliffs. The path ahead opened up into a small ledge overlooking the lake, and the wind had thankfully softened. Still, Hermione brushed a stray curl from her face, panting a little. "You could have at least told me to wear better shoes." "I knew you would say that," Emil said, "but if I told you in advance, you wouldn't have come." "I'm beginning to see why," she muttered, eyeing the sheer drop beside them. Still, despite her complaints, curiosity was blooming in her chest. There was nothing obvious out here, no village, no ruins, not even a garden. Just cliffs and wind and the endless reach of mountains beyond. What could possibly be worth dragging me outside of the fortress for? She asked, quieter now. Emil didn't answer. He just nodded ahead. Keep walking, he said. It's just around the bend. Hermione followed, suspicious but intrigued despite herself. But the bend turned into another bend, and another, and another. Hermione's scowl deepened with each one. You said it was just there, she snapped after what felt like 20 minutes of scrambling over rocks and ducking under crooked fir branches. Emil, if this is your idea of a scenic stroll, I want it known for the record that I'm never listening to you again. You say that every time, he called back over his shoulder. His voice was faintly amused, breath coming quick in the chill air. And yet you're still following me. That's because I'm naive, not patient. He laughed, a soft, boyish sound that echoed strangely against the stone, and pressed forward. The mountain path was even narrower now, and Hermione felt suffocatingly closed in by the two steep faces of granite. It was rocky, too, and she had to use both hands to steady herself at quite a few points. Her fingers were red with cold, and her curls had long since escaped her fur hat. If this ends with us getting eaten by our mountain troll, she muttered under her breath, I am hunting you. Almost there, Emil promised again. Emil, if you say that one more oh, the words froze on her lips. The narrow path widened abruptly into a small plateau, a hollow carved into the mountainside. Before them loomed a vast opening in the rock, its mouth rimmed with frost and streaked with veins of mineral shimmer. A thin trickle of water ran down from above, freezing into glassy curtains that clinked faintly in the wind. A cave. Hermione blinked, caught between irritation and awe. You brought me to a hole in the mountain. Emil's lips twitched. Not just any hole. Come look. He stepped forward, ducking slightly as he entered the cave. Hermione followed hesitantly, the air inside immediately cooler and strangely still. The stone walls breathed cold light. Veins of quartz pulsed faintly when the sun struck them through the ice at the entrance. The sound changed the moment she stepped inside. It was as though the cave swallowed the outside world, no wind, no sea, no crunch of gravel, just an immense, resonant silence. And yet, as Hermione took another step, her boot scuffing against the stone, that silence stirred. The faint sound bounced back at her, not as an echo exactly, but as something softer and more deliberate. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Hermione looked around. The walls had been carved deliberately. Spiraling runes and sigils were etched into the stone. They were ancient, pre-Elder Futhark, similar to the ones in the book on old magic Hermione had been translating. Emil turned back toward her, eyes bright in the dim. It's called the Cave of Listening, he said quietly. Old legend says it remembers sound. Every noise ever made in here lingers, too faint for the ear, but still the... Hermione frowned, looking up at the high, arched ceiling. Frost traced the rock in white filigree, glittering faintly like veins of silver. That's impossible. Sound dissipates, it can't just linger forever. Can't it? Emil asked, smiling faintly. Magic remembers, so does the world if you know how to listen. She folded her arms. That's poetic nonsense. He laughed under his breath. Maybe. But can't nonsense be nice sometimes? Hermione opened her mouth to retort, but then she stopped. The air in the cave seemed to hum faintly, not with any one tone, but with 1,000 layers of almost sound, too soft to be distinct, like breath against glass. What is that? She whispered. The mountain, Emil said simply, or the past, depends who you ask. He walked further in, his steps measured, slow. When the older students come here, they say if you stand in silence long enough, the cave will start whispering back. Some say it repeats what it hears from your thoughts, not your voice. Hermione raised a skeptical eyebrow, but the faint shimmer in the air, the way sound seemed to stretch and fade like mist, kept her from dismissing it outright. That sounds rather like a place for superstition, not study. Then it's perfect for you, Emil said, grinning. She gave him a narrow look. I don't do superstition. No, he agreed, but out of curiosity. He knelt by a shallow pool near the wall, where the thin trickle of frozen water thawed into motion again. The first time I came here, he said, I tried casting. Even a simple Lumos light behaves strangely here. It doesn't spread properly, like it's being swallowed by the rock. Hermione crouched beside him, watching the faint ripple across the surface of the water. The reflected light seemed to twist, pulling downward instead of outward. She frowned. That's not a natural phenomenon. No, Emil murmured. That's why I like it. Hermione hesitated. You think it's some kind of magical resonance chamber or some such, made to preserve all that comes in sound spells? Maybe, Emil said, brushing frost from the stone. Or maybe it's where Durmstrang listens back. She stared at him, both annoyed and intrigued. You really do have a taste for drama, don't you? He smiled slightly, but his gaze remained on the still water. My brothers don't think so, he said after a pause. They say this place is boring. You have brothers? Asked Hermione. Two, he said. Artemius and Alexander, both older, both very loud. They're in the upper years, always in the thick of something. Dueling, broom racing, arguments with anyone who looks at them the wrong way. They don't really have the patience for quiet. Hermione looked around at the cavern's glassy silence. And you do? I guess so. He dipped his hand briefly into the water, and the ripples shivered with that same strange inward pull. I used to come here a lot with Astrid. Her father and mine both went to Durmstrang. They used to sneak down here too, apparently thought the echoes helped them listen to their thoughts. Now she's usually with her new friend, Lars. Hermione blinked. Astrid was her partner in natural magic, and she spent so much time talking about Lars there, Hermione had forgotten they weren't dating yet. The fourth year, he nodded solemnly. The one who thinks his luscious golden hair is a personality. Hermione tried not to laugh, but the sound escaped anyway. Emil looked faintly pleased by that, but his attention soon returned to the pool. It's strange, he said quietly. When you're down here long enough, you start hearing things you didn't mean to. The cave doesn't echo, at least not normally. It reminds, like I dunno, it wants to return your thoughts to you. That sounds dreadful, said Hermione, though softly. Maybe. But I like it. He turned his hand in the water, watching the reflection break into fragmented lines of light. Velstria is not exactly known for its peace. At home, you can't hear yourself think over the sea and the wind and the hustle and bustle. There's just always so much going on. Here it's the opposite, just whispers. It's nice, and I can even hear her voice sometimes. Hermione tilted her head. Astrid's? No, he said, a little too quickly, losing his thoughtfulness. Well, that's not the only reason I go here, of course. Not some obsessed creep or anything. At that, Hermione giggled. Emil shot her a mock glare before splashing some pool water at her, causing Hermione to squawk indignantly. Emil, she hissed, jerking her crimson robes back and glaring at the damp spots spreading up the hem. You utter child. He grinned a crooked smile that made him look far more like the younger brother of two incorrigible troublemakers. Consider it revenge, for the giggling. That was hardly giggling, Hermione said primly, brushing futilely at the wet fabric. That was contemptuous laughter, he offered, a perfectly appropriate response to such a ridiculous comment. He laughed again, and it echoed softly through the cavern, bouncing back in warped, whispering tones. The sound seemed to linger longer than it should have caught by the stone, stretched thin and soft, like silk being pulled apart. Hermione stilled, listening. It really does sound different here, she murmured. Emil sobered, following her gaze as the ripples in the pool stilled again. Yeah, he said quietly, like the mountain doesn't quite let go of what it hears. Well, said Hermione at last, if it listens back, it's only polite we give it something worth remembering. Emil glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. What would that be? Hermione smiled brightly. Questions, of course. Emil groaned softly, though the corner of his mouth twitched. Of course it would be questions. God forbid you let the universe have any peace. Hermione crouched again beside the pool, her reflection shivering on its surface. Peace is overrated, she said, her tone airy. Besides, if this place remembers sound, maybe it remembers answers too. Emil sat down cross-legged beside her, chin in hand. And what exactly are you planning to ask? What's the meaning of life? Why can't Emil stop dragging me up cliffs? Don't tempt me, she said with marked severity before looking back to the water. For a moment she seemed almost solemn, the faint light catching in her curls. All right, Cave, she said softly, half teasing, half curious. What are you? The word echoed a little too long, a little too deep. It came back to them warped, as though spoken by a dozen other voices in slow succession. You, Hermione blinked. It answered. Guess it liked the question. Hermione shivered slightly, though she smiled again. I think I'd like to study it properly sometime. The resonance patterns, I mean. Of course you would, Emil said, snorting. Most people come here to think. You bring parchment and quills. She shot him a look. And you'd still end up copying my notes. He laughed again. The sound rippled against the walls and returned softer and slower, like the cave itself was reluctant to let it go. For a while, neither of them spoke. The pool shimmered faintly in the thin light. The mountain breathed its slow, cold air. Then Hermione straightened, brushing her gloves. Come on, she said briskly. If we don't go now, we'll miss supper. Emil stood too, smiling faintly. And that would be a tragedy. It would, she said firmly. I skipped breakfast for the library, and I refuse to starve for your nostalgia. He laughed as they stepped out into the pale, snow-bright air. Behind them, the cave fell silent once more, except for a faint echo, softer than breath, of her voice asking one of the many questions it would keep forever. What are you? The natural magic glass house shimmered faintly under the midday sun, its vaulted panes misted with condensation. Rows of low stone tables stretched between clusters of ferns and suspended roots, each workbench half swallowed by creeping vines and open textbooks. The scent of crushed herbs and damp stone hung heavy in the air. Hermione adjusted her goggles, already halfway through calibrating the tuning fork suspended above their work table. The delicate tone it produced somewhere between a hum and a sigh made the surface of the water in the shallow dish below tremble in fractal ripples. Astrid, perched elegantly on the stool beside her, wasn't paying the slightest attention. And then Lars said he'd dress her of the practice hall all evening, she said, dreamy-eyed. Can yow believeth that, for me? I mean, he said it was for the group, but honestly, Hermione, he looked right at me when he said it. Hermione turned one page in her notes without looking up. At first, she had gotten along with Astrid well enough. But after being her partner in natural magic class, Hermione began to realize that the Swedish witch was not a girl she liked very much at all. That's great, but perhaps we should focus on the assigned activity, yes, she asked tersely, marking down the resonance frequencies for each mineral fragment on their tray. Lars isn't going to give you a higher mark in this class, after all. Could you hand me the piece of Celestine, please? The blue one. Are there any other pieces of Celestine here you can identify? Asked Hermione, pursing her lips. Honestly, haven't you read the course book at all? Astrid plucked it delicately between two manicured fingers and handed it over. You know, she said, I think Lars really feels things deeply. He's got that sort of brooding quality, don't you think? Once she placed the Celestine on the marked circle, Hermione tapped the tuning fork again. The tone deepened, a perfect interval aligning with the copper threads. That sounds nice. Nice, but entirely unrelated to this coursework. It wasness, Astrid said, leaning closer, and he asked if I'd finished my numerology chart for Master Raskov. I mean, obviously I hadn't, but the way he said it was so tasing. Like he might as well just have ravaged me there. It was a great wish of Hermione's to say something disparaging, but instead she turned her attention to the apparatus before her, a set of suspended stones arranged in an intricate circle, each hovering just slightly above the tabletop. The task was simple to measure harmonic resonance under shifting lunar frequencies, but Master Thalberg's assignments were never just simple. She began to hum softly, adjusting the pitch with a tuning rod until the stones quivered faintly in response. Astrid, meanwhile, prattled on. I think he really likes me, you know. Everyone says Lars doesn't pay attention Tonion outside his dueling circle, but he noticed when I wore my hair up on Tuesday. You think that means something, don't you? Carefully calibrating the next crystal, Hermione said. Perhaps he's observant. He seems like the type who'd pay close attention to things that matter, such as his natural magic work, perhaps. Full attention is required for such matters, Astrid, and it's quite irresponsible. Oh, you're so right. He notices details, that's what I like about him. Astrid paused, twirling a strand of pale hair. You know, you ought to be a bit less serious, Hermione. You're very clever, but I think people would like you better if you smiled more. Buto, no, you've got those awful buck teeth, and nobody wants to see that. You really should use the shrinking charm on them. Anthan starts smiling. She gave an innocent look to Hermione. I'm not trying to be mean, of course. Just friendly advice, girl to girl, you know. Well, I think there are much more important things to learn from much more important people, huffed Hermione. A professor, for one. Are you even taking proper notes? Then, the tuning fork in her hand vibrated again, and a clear tone filled the air, sweet and high as glass. The hovering stones shimmered, their pale runes glowing faintly blue. Around them, the leaves trembled, resonating in sympathy. Hermione felt her chest tighten not with nerves, but with the sudden exhilaration of understanding. She adjusted the frequency once more and watched as one of the stones drifted slightly out of alignment. The harmonic field bent, and a faint pulse echoed through the air like a heartbeat. It wasn't just sound, it was motion, gravity, structure. Orbital resonance, she thought, not only in planets, but in matter itself. The same ratios that hold moons steady could, in theory, stabilize transformation. Her mind leapt, unbidden, to Master Capel's book Theory of Substances. The notion of elemental bonds as mutable harmonics, the frequencies of identity itself. What if transfiguration could be seen not only as the forcing of change, but the retuning of a material's inner song? She scribbled notes furiously, forgetting Astrid entirely. When she finally looked up, Master Thalberg was standing nearby, one thick brow raised. He usually regarded Hermione's methodical correctness with the mild disdain of someone bored by perfection, but now there was a flicker of surprise behind his spectacles. Miss Morgenstern, he said, voice rough as gravel, I see you've gone a touch beyond the instructions. Hermione froze, halfway through an equation. Ah, yes, sir. I was testing whether the resonance coefficients align with the orbital ratios mentioned in De Harmonia Mundi. Thalberg leaned closer, glancing over her parchment. His lips twitched, almost a smile, almost. HMPH. You'd be wise not to show that paper to your classmates. Half of them would explode their workbenches trying to prove it wrong. I'll be careful, Hermione said quickly. As he walked away, she allowed herself the smallest smile. Astrid leaned across the table, eyes wide. Oh my gods, he liked your work, she whispered. You've got to teach me how to do that. Maybe I can impress Lars during his next study session, Hedda Resslever girls. Only the pretty ones, though. Hermione, already lost in her notes again, said. When she looked up once more, she caught Conrad's eyes across the glass house, his expression unreadable. He looked away quickly, back to his own experiment, but not before she caught the faintest curve of a smile. Swallowing, Hermione pushed her quill back into motion and tried very hard not to think about it. When class ended, the glasshouse doors opened with a sigh, letting out a swirl of cold, resin-scented air as Hermione stepped into the late afternoon light. Her satchel was heavy with notes and the faint clinking of crystal vials, proof of a productive class, if not a pleasant one. Astrid had lingered behind with her two friends, Liv and Sophia, their quiet laughter drifting faintly through the open windows. Hermione restrained herself from rolling her eyes. She was halfway down the frost-dusted path when something caught her ankle. Her world pitched sideways, parchments, quills, and books spilling from her satchel in an inelegant tumble. The impact jarred her knees, a gasp escaping before she caught herself on her palms. Really, she muttered through clenched teeth, brushing her hair out of her face. Behind her there was a stifled giggle, light and airy. Hermione didn't need to look to know who it belonged to, of course. For some reason, Hermione was starting to think Astrid wasn't quite as dumbly sweet as she seemed. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself upright, when a shadow fell over her scattered things. "Here," said a low voice. Conrad knelt beside her, his dark cloak trailing against the speckled stones. He moved with a kind of deliberate calm, picking up her books one by one and stacking them neatly. His hands were steady and sure, and very soft-looking, too. "Thank you," Hermione said, trying to gather her notes before the damp ground could ruin them. "It's nothing," he replied. Up close, she could see what Emil meant. Conrad didn't need to announce his confidence. It was in the way he held his shoulders, the ease in his movements. He wasn't arrogant so much as assured, as though the universe had simply arranged itself to suit him. When he straightened, he extended her copy aft Harmonia Mundi with a faint half-smile. "You've got a good grasp of Thalberg's lecture. Most don't bother reading the footnotes, let alone the cross-references." Pierre's cited paper in the Hermetic Page was a fascinating read, wasn't it? Hermione blinked. "You actually noticed that?" "I notice what others overlook," he said lightly. She flushed, ducking her head to scoop up the last of her quills. That was when she saw it, a small square of parchment half buried under the edge of her satchel. It wasn't one of hers. The handwriting was jagged, all capital letters pressed deep into the fibers. "I know what you are." A chill rippled through her. For a heartbeat, everything else seemed to vanish. Hermione's fingers trembled slightly as she snatched it up and crumpled it into her fist. "Miss Morgenstern," Conrad's voice pulled her back. He was watching her, thin brows furrowed slightly. "Oh, nothing," she said quickly, forcing a small, brittle smile. "Just an old note." Before he could question it, she stuffed the paper deep into her satchel. "Well, thank you so much again," she said, slinging the strap over her shoulder and gathering what remained of her composure. "I'll see you in class." Conrad inclined his head. "Of course." As she walked away, Hermione could still feel the crumpled note burning against her side. She didn't know who had written it or what exactly they thought they knew, but she could suspect. Chapter 9. Half-hardened. In the days after, Hermione found herself buried deeper than ever in her books, spending practically every waking hour in the library or hunched over her desk in the dormitory, parchments spread in a halo of ink and cramped handwriting. She told herself it was just diligence, but she knew better. The note hadn't left her mind. The scrap of parchment had long since been burned, of course outside, though due to the no flames rule of Durmstrang, barring natural magic class. She had even caught herself more than once unconsciously scanning faces in the corridors. The fourth years lounging by the stairs, the trio of older boys in red-trimmed robes whispering by the dueling hall, even Astrid, smiling with that constant, sickly sweetness at breakfast. Everyone looked the same as ever, which only made it worse. But days passed, and then weeks, and nothing happened. No follow-up note. No strange looks beyond the usual. No mysterious voice calling her out. Just schoolwork and winter creeping slowly down the mountains. Eventually, she let herself breathe again. Classes were going well, better than well, really. Her transfiguration essays had grown quite advanced in theory. Her grasp of natural magic was ahead of nearly everyone else's. Even Master Raskov, who rarely spared anything but faint derision for her eagerness in arithmancy, had muttered something resembling commendable insight during her last recitation period. When she wasn't in class, she buried herself in theory of substances, finally finishing its dense chapters on mineral correspondences and elemental compatibility. And once she was done with that, she moved on to the nature and limits of partial transfiguration soon enough. It was quite tricky magic, as it bypassed an object's intrinsic telos scope and introduced discontinuity along the gradient of the transformed and non-transformed parts. This so-called thaumic schism made partial transfigurations quite perilous to mess up, which was why Hermione refused to practice them until she understood more. All the while, Hermione was still steadily translating the runic book. though it was more an exercise in fascination than practical study. It detailed a nameless group of ancient Nordic wizards and their wild experiments with the boundaries of spellcraft, what worked, what didn't, and often what blew up in their faces. Wanting some way to refer to it, Hermione had dubbed it the Eskay-Jold manuscript, after a name scrawled faintly in one of its margins. It was an odd comfort, calling it something. It made the mysterious feel manageable. And so life at Durmstrang, at least on the surface, was back to its usual rhythm. Though now that rhythm was changing. By mid-October, the talk in every corridor had shifted to a single topic, the opening of the inter-school matches. It was an old tradition, Durmstrang, facing off against magical academies from across the northern and central regions of Europe in both Quidditch and dueling. There were teams from the Kalmar Union, the Wizarding Alliance of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, along with a few from the Baltics, the Balkans, and Central Europe. The first match, everyone said, would be against a small but notoriously scrappy school from Lip, Oaklight. Banners darning Durmstrang's crest, the double-headed eagles all burning bright, were already appearing in the hallways. The dueling hall had grown crowded again, full of sparring students showing off for the coming exhibition rounds. Emil's older brothers were fuming mad that they had not been picked to compete in either Quidditch or dueling. Astrid was talking of nothing but who might make the school's reserve teams. The morning of the match dawned crisp and blue, the kind of brittle northern light that made the mountains seem carved from glass. The great Quidditch pitch carved into a hollow near the base of the cliffs, and rimmed by high stands of dark wood, was already roaring with life by the time Hermione followed Emil and Astrid through the crowd. Astrid had been planning to watch with Liv and Emma, but once she had seen Hermione, had unfortunately taken it upon herself to come along with her and Emil instead. It felt as though all of Durmstrang had turned out. Dozens after dozens of students in red robes streamed down the paths, waving banners that flashed colorful enchantments. The Oaklight delegation, recognizable by their green cloaks stitched with a silver boar, clustered on the far side, their shouts rolling up the hill like thunder. Hermione, clutching the rail of the stairs a bit too tightly, tried to seem interested rather than overwhelmed. It wasn't that she disliked sport. Precisely, she just didn't see the point of flinging yourself around the sky on enchanted broomsticks when a good book existed, but that seeing the typically composed Durmstrang students let loose was quite a sight. Hermione was even half sure she saw her roommate, Iva, smiling. Smiling. "Oh, this is perfect weather," Astrid gushed as they found seats halfway up. "Cold enough that you can see every trail the quaffle makes in the air, but not enough that we're completely freezing." Hermione, who had no idea how one could see a quaffle trail, merely nodded and tried to fold her hands neatly in her lap. "You've never actually seen a match, have you?" Emil asked, noticing her quiet. Hermione had read about Quidditch, of course, thoroughly. Quidditch Through the Ages had been one of the first magical books she'd checked out from the Hogwarts library before her very first flying lesson. Theoretical knowledge, though, had not helped her enjoy being off the ground. Thankfully, she'd only be watching this time. "Well, I've read about it, of course," Hermione said, a touch defensive. "It's just, well, I told you before that my parents died, and my current guardians are Muggles. So I grew up in the Muggle world primarily as a result, and I learned magic from private tutelage. This is really my first time being immersed in such an environment." "Muggles?" asked Emil, wide-eyed. "Wow, how'd you get in that situation?" "Shouldn't you have been put in a proper wizarding home?" Hermione pursed her lips. "My mother was a Muggle. She was close to them when she was alive." Emil's eyes were practically bulging at this point. "You're a half-blood." "But you are so good at magic. Albus Dumbledore is a half-blood, and he defeated the pure-blooded Grindelwald," said Hermione snappishly. "Wonder how that worked, if you believe he must be a blithering fool." "Don't be a bigot, Emil," Astrid said, flashing her a smile. "I've always thought one drop of wizarding blood burns out most of the impurities, you know. And your mother was the Muggle one, to boot, so you're carrying a magical name, at least." An irrelevant one, but one nonetheless. Hermione's eyes narrowed, but Astrid went on. Still, it's awfully tragic you learned magic only through books and teachers. All those hours reading, and none spent actually enjoying anything. It must be exhausting. Emil shot her a mild look. Astrid, what? She said innocently. It's true. I couldn't memorize that many factoids even if I tried. I'm sure you've got other talents, Hermione said, her eyes fixed on the field. You'll find them someday, hopefully. Astrid's smile dropped. Oh, you're a real riot. Emil just sighed, the sound nearly lost in the roar of the crowd. An awkward tension descended upon them for a moment, before Astrid perked up once more as the Durmstrang players began to swoop by for warm-up laps. Ooh, that's Yelena. She's a beater best aim you'll ever see. It's funny, because that witch is so great at flying, but stopped riding broomsticks a while ago, if you know what I mean. At least, that's if the rumors about her and Gisel are true. Oh, and there, look, Victor. Hermione followed her pointing hand, and the crowd erupted all at once. A dark-haired boy in deep red robes had just streaked across the pitch on his broom, moving so fast Hermione barely caught more than a blur of motion before he pulled into a breathtaking dive. That's Victor Crumb, Astrid said with reverence. 5th year, Seeker, top of his class. He's well, you'll see. Emil was grinning too. He's incredible. I saw him practice once he caught a snitch in under 30 seconds. In fog. Hermione blinked, impressed despite herself. 30 seconds, that's impossible. Well, no, not impossible, I suppose. Improbable, more like. Are you sure it was that quick? Did you have a timer with you? Astrid laughed lightly. Oh, listen to her. God, Hermione, you sound like an even more fussy Master Raskov. Hermione flushed, though Emil chuckled under his breath. It's true, though, he said. Crumb's not normal. He flies like the broom's just another limb. A whistle blew from the far end of the pitch, sharp and clean, slicing through the roar of the stands. The two teams circled into position, Durmstrang's scarlet robes catching the light like streaks of flame, while the Oaklite players in forest green moved with more predatory caution than grace. The referee, a squat witch in slate-grey robes, raised her wand. A hum passed through the air like static. Then, with a single flick, the game began. The quaffle shot upward in a red blur. Hermione's breath caught as a Durmstrang chaser, broad-shouldered, hair in a golden braid, snatched it mid-air and hurtled toward the opposing goals. The crowd screamed, scarves and banners rippling in the mountain wind. Hermione clutched the railing tighter. Even if she didn't love the game itself, it was impossible not to feel something at the sight. The speed, the coordination, the sheer recklessness of it all, it was chaos, yes, but an organized chaos. Every pass and counter had its rhythm, and every collision had its strange, violent symmetry. God, she muttered, half to herself. The braking force must be absurd. What ray the enchantments for that? We learn Arresto momentum later in the year, and I assume the underlying principles are at least somewhat similar, yes. And the bludgers, how do they owe? A bludger slammed past the stands, close enough to ruffle the ends of her hair. Hermione ducked instinctively, pressing closer to Emil. He tried not to laugh. Astrid, meanwhile, was shrieking with delight. Did you see that hit? Perfect angle, she cried. Oh, Yelenas and fire today. Hermione cautiously straightened, cheeks pink, and tried to smooth her robes. I don't see what's so enjoyable about watching people nearly die for sport. Astrid giggled. Well, it's a little less boring than whatever you do in your free time, isn't it? Emil shot her another warning glance, but Hermione ignored it this time. She was too caught up watching the chasers weave and spiral in midair. See, Emil said lightly. You are enjoying it, aren't you? Hermione rolled her eyes, but still watched the match in rapt attention. Oaklite's players, dressed in forest green, were quicker and more precise in their passing, and within minutes they had scored twice. The Durmstrang crowd groaned. Astrid groaned louder. Oh, come on, Astrid said, clutching her head dramatically. How are they letting that keeper through? He's practically asleep. Somebody castronavate or something. This is the most awful thing I've seen since Polyakov's hairy back. What's Durmstrang come to? God, I'm transferring. Is God even real? He wouldn't allow Thisso know. Am I in hell already? Screw this. I don't even want to look. Emil, look for me. She hid her eyes with her hands then. I think Oaklight's strategy is quite effective, said Hermione, vaguely impressed as she saw the way the chasers formed a rotating triangle. They've clearly trained to exploit Durmstrang's defensive gaps, since our team's strategy seems quite offensive-heavy. It's not just our keeper's fault, really. Compare Oaklight's chasers and ours. They all have clearly delineated roles, while ours each vie to just get the quaffle in. The planning's impeccable on their parts, really. Astrid peeked through her fingers to look at Hermione. I asked Emilto, be my eyes last time I remember. No offense, but you make it sound like you're drafting an essay, and I want to redirect that negative energy right now. Some of us just enjoy things. How about just cursing when it gets too bad instead, all right? That did not amuse Hermione very much. Well, some of us find understanding more enjoyable than shouting. Emil, sitting between them, stifled a laugh behind his glove. But as the match went on, even Hermione's composure began to fray. Victor Crumb, that hooked nose, sharp-browed fifth-year seeker, had taken to the air like he was born there. His broom sliced through the currents with unnerving precision, every tilt and angle a study in control. He didn't even seem to look for the snitch he felt for it, scanning the air with the eerie focus of a hawk. Down below, Oaklight scored again, then again. The score read 120 to 50 in flaming digits, and Astrid was muttering curses in rapid Swedish, while Emil's eyes were wide and fretful. Hermione was chewing on her bottom lip, almost leaning out of her seat. But before Oaklight's chasers could even reset their formation, the pitch erupted in gasps. A streak of red plummeted dove from 30 feet up. Hermione's heart lurched as Crumb vanished into the cloud of breath fog and cold mist near the ground, the roar of the crowd dying into a stunned hush. Then he pulled up sharply, snitch clutched tight in his gloved hand. The stands exploded. Astrid screamed with delight, throwing her arms up. Emil was grinning ear to ear, shouting over the noise. I told you. Fog, clear skies, it doesn't matter. Hermione just stared, her mouth slightly open. She had read about great seekers, but reading was nothing like watching it unfold in front of her. The way Crumb had moved was less like a student and more like a creature born to the air. It was in short order that Hermione left the match. The second part, the dueling games, would be held tomorrow afternoon, and since the professors had decided to assign little homework in advance for today, Hermione had nothing to do for the remainder of the day. She and Emil had planned to go back to the listening cave together, but as soon as Astrid heard that she and Emil had plans, her own plans with her other friends disappeared in the blink of an eye. And so had Emil's plans with Hermione's. Once Astrid invited him to her dormitory, still, as she crossed the black-stoned path of the courtyard, her boots clicking, the cheers from the pitch still echoed faintly in her head, and for once she didn't mind the windy chill. Victor's breathtaking dive had left her oddly exhilarated, almost even proud of a school that wasn't quite hers. She could understand now why people got caught up in the fever of Quidditch. Hermione was halfway to the dormitories when a smooth voice stopped her in her tracks. Miss Morgenstern. Hermione's spine went rigid. Slowly, she turned. Mistress Varric was standing near the arched doorway that led toward the northern corridor, her black fur cloak immaculate, her smile even more so. Behind her, a faint curl of blue-gray smoke rose from the wand she held, as if she just used the extinguishing charm. She likely had, probably due to a student who wanted to conjure up some fire to warm themselves up during the match. Mistress Varric, Hermione said politely, fighting to keep her voice level. Good afternoon. The woman inclined her head. And to you, you seem in rather high spirits. The match, I assume. Yes, mistress. Ah, said Varric, in that lilting way of hers. I do hope Durmstrang's triumph was instructive. Victory, after all, is rarely achieved through mere enthusiasm. It demands understanding. Hermione wasn't sure why Varric was speaking as if this were a lecture, but nodded nonetheless. She was almost free to go when Varrick's hand, white and ringed with some black stone, lifted ever so slightly. "Walk with me." Hermione's stomach sank. "Of course, mistress." They moved down the hall together, Varrick's heels clicking in an even rhythm. "I've been reviewing your progress," Varrick began conversationally. "You've a strong grasp of the theory, particularly in tracing the mechanics and taxonomy of the Docker schools. Your essay on emotional resonance in cursorcraft was impressive. Thank you, mistress. And yet," Varrick continued, turning her head slightly toward Hermione, "I've heard from your other professors that you've been requesting almost constant additional readings and supplementary work, even in classes you aren't a part of, such as runes. You requested Mistress Thorson's aid with translating a rather old book you stumbled upon in the library, yes. Yes, Roman too did, and I have been trying to push myself. I find lots of the course material fascinating, and I feel as if there is always more I can do to completely understand it." Varrick's smile deepened. "Indeed. So why," she said softly, "do I not see that same hunger in my own subject? You confine yourself to the coursebook. You practice the required spells and no more. You are almost restrained. I admit I'm starting to feel quite left out." She laughed, a light, airy sort of thing. Dark magic is a delicate subject, mistress. I thought it wise to follow instruction rather than try to go above and beyond. Prudent. But Durmstrang does not produce the prudent, Miss Morgenstern. It produces the capable, the decisive. Prudence belongs to those who are afraid of consequence." Hermione swallowed. "I understand. Do you?" Varrick asked. "Because when you performed the maddening spell on the practice mouse last week, I noticed your incantation was technically correct, but the execution lacked conviction. A curse's strength lies not in pronunciation, but in intent. And I rather think," she said, eyes narrowing, "you find it difficult to summon ill will." Hermione's heart pounded so hard it was difficult to breathe. She forced a polite smile. Perhaps I'm simply not inclined toward cruelty, mistress." Varrick tilted her head, her black hair loosening further in its bun. "You would not be human if you weren't. We all desire to have power, to control the uncontrollable. I don't think you're being quite truthful if you say there's no one you would gladly cast that hex on. But then again," her tone softened to something almost gentle, "perhaps you simply haven't found your truth yet." They stopped before the stairwell that led to the lower dormitories. Varrick's gaze lingered for one moment too long. "You may go," she said finally, voice pleasant again. "Do review Chapter 9 before Monday. I expect your next demonstration to be enlightening. I really do think you have a talent for the arts, Miss Morgenstern. It'd be a shame to let that go to waste." Hermione murmured a thank you and hurried away, her pulse thundering in her ears. She didn't let herself exhale until she turned the corner, well out of sight. Her legs felt leaden even as she reached the narrow corridor that led to the North Tower. She fumbled at the heavy door and pushed inside, breath hitching with the relief of warmth. There were, as always, two nameplates on the doorframe, small rectangles of wood with brass letters. For a heartbeat, she didn't register the letters at all, then her eyes fixed on them and her stomach dropped. The name on top, withdrew, was quite normal, but on the bottom, Hermione Granger. She froze. Then, in a breath, her wand was out. Her wand traced the motion for standard inanimate to inanimate untransfigurations, and the Granger engraving slowly morphed back to its original state off Morgenstern. With a still racing heart, Hermione rushed into her room, bolting the door behind her. For many moments, she pressed her back against the thick wood, trying to steady her breathing. Someone knew, and they were taunting her. The dormitory was empty and silent, save for the rustle of pine branches against the window. Slowly, Hermione forced herself to move one step, then another until she reached her bed. The orbs of spell light held in the bronze sconces cast a soft, flickering glow across the room, catching on the edge of her pillow. Something was there. Something that Hermione knew hadn't been there this morning. It was a small roll of parchment, bound with a thin black ribbon. With a dry mouth and trembling fingers, Hermione reached out and unrolled it. The handwriting was different this time, not jagged block capitals, but an elegant, careful script that made her skin crawl. It was calm, as if threatening her place in the wizarding world was akin to inviting her to tea. During tomorrow's duel, ensure Luca Litvak loses. Do not draw attention. This will prove your loyalty. You know what happens if you fail. There was no signature, no seal, nothing to identify who had written it. But the faint scent clinging to the parchment resin and smoke made Hermione's stomach twist unpleasantly. She thought of Mistress Varric, her wand slightly smoking for some odd reason. Perhaps it had not been from putting out a student's disastrous attempt to warm themselves up, or whatever Hermione had initially believed. Perhaps it had been a calling card. For a long moment Hermione simply stared at the paper until the room swam. Panic overtook her, her breaths coming in short spurts. Her chest heaved, and her lower lip began to tremble. Why, she thought desperately, why is this happening to me? And loyalty, loyalty to what? But terror could not consume her, she knew, and so she pulled herself together, if barely. She would not cry. She would not. She would simply weigh her options with the logic that had always defined her. If it was a trap, if the sender wanted her to get caught, then she could get expelled. If the sender only wanted to see whether she would act, and then unmask her nonetheless, then she would Sorelli be expelled. If she replied to coercion with defiance, and they knew her, Secret Hermione bit her lip. But she thought if she complied, and it wasn't a trap, then she could preserve the secret for now. She could keep her place here, continue to learn, and make actual, steady progress in magic, rather than being shunted back to a Muggle comprehensive school, where she could at most hope to perhaps sneak away to Diagon Alley every once in a while to buy books. At that moment, something hardened within her. It was unfair. It was wrong. But Hermione had worked so hard to get here, and she could not let anything threaten that. And so she smoothed the scroll flat, reading the command again. Luca Litvak was a sixth-year, talented but egotistical. She had seen him bowl over a first-year girl for getting in his way while he was walking to class, and he had sent a curse at Hermione herself for taking too long to get up the steps. He was hardly a very nice boy, she could surmise. Although even as Hermione told herself that, she knew this was just her excuse to tip the scales of the duel while still seeming moral. Still, she sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to think like a wizard who was less soft-hearted than she. How, practically, could she interfere and still sleep at night? Dark curses and directly violent acts were out by principle, and because they would be too noticeable. She needed a method that was both subtle and reversible so she wouldn't get caught. It needed to be within her skill set, or at the very least, learnable within the given time frame of a day. At once, ideas began to flood Hermione's mind and began to coalesce into three broad categories of attacks. One was to tamper with his equipment, but what equipment exactly? She could slip an enchanted object on him, one that would either make the judges believe he was a cheater or one that would actually hinder his ability. But that would be too obvious. Or she could simply mess with his wand, perhaps replace it, even, but that again seemed too easy to trace back to her. And so, that category was slashed first from her potential ideas. Onto the second then, creating a distraction. She knew the thunderclap charm, had learned it from Durmstrang's second-year coursebooks, and had cast it perfectly during the entrance examination. That could break his concentration at the crucial moment, or even the simple red spark spell she had learned in Hogwarts. But again, too obvious. There would be witnesses all around who could point at her and say she had done it. Although she supposed she could perhaps make a triggered enchantment, but that would still draw attention. The instructions had expressly forbid that. But the third type of attack Hermione had thought of could work, perhaps, indirectly tilting the match in the Oaklite representative's favor. Altering the dueling surface itself would allow covertness and freedom that the other options did not have. But how could she? There was the softening charm, which had actually been one of the first spells Hermione had learned to cast, over a year ago on her first and last time in the Hogwarts Express. But making rocks suddenly spongy was not exactly the most subtle of actions. The cutting charm, similarly, would be too obvious, especially to the hawk-eyed judges. Hermione's minds raced through her entire catalogue of charms, yet all seemed too clear to work. And worse, most of these charms were easily detectable. Suddenly, then, a thought struck Hermione. Charms were not the answer. Transfiguration was. If magic could persuade matter to accept a new form, then partial transfiguration, deliberately marking out and limiting the scope of change, could perhaps prove Hermione's strongest advantage. A small, targeted partial transfiguration of the dueling rings, stone altering a foot's width patch to a temporary slickness, or to slightly dampen magical conduction, would be both subtle and reversible. It would be easy to pass off as a clumsy accident if Lucas slipped or stumbled. The real difficulty wasn't creation, though, she knew. It was precision, telling the spell exactly where to start and exactly where to stop. But Hermione had not practiced actually doing so yet. Her supplementary readings in Transfiguration had been mostly about understanding form and matter more, both as general concepts and how they apply to specific objects. And her practical work was constrained to class, where they practiced simple animative transfigurations. And yet it was her best shot nonetheless. It was with a peculiar antsiness that Hermione went around the fortress afterwards. She had picked up a pebble from the Quidditch pitch that afternoon, the Durmstrang banners still flapping in the crisp wind as she looked furtively around. After, she had gone straight to her dormitory to get the half-finished textbook she had been reading for the past 2 weeks, On the Nature and Limits of Partial Transfiguration, by Edda Hallberg, the kind of dense, formulaic treatise few students ever opened willingly. Now, hours later, it still lay open before her, its cramped words swimming before her tired eyes. The ink gleamed faintly in the candlelight. Iva had gone to bed hours ago, having exchanged the typical courteous good nights with Hermione. Her quill lay discarded, her tea had gone cold, and still Hermione couldn't make it work. She had tried everything, the incantations precisely as the book described, and her own alterations based on theory of substances, but every attempt either did too much or too little. The pebble would shimmer faintly, half soften, then snap back to its original state. Once, it had begun to melt like wax before she panicked and cancelled the spell. Another time, the desk had turned slick instead of the stone. Hermione pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes and breathed out shakily. "Come on," she whispered to herself. "You can do this." She closed her eyes. In her mind, she didn't see the pebble anymore. She saw its structure, the ordered lattice of its minerals, the way its essence held together under the soft authority of form. Transfiguration was persuasion, not domination. You told the world a new story about itself, and the world, if you were convincing enough, believed you. Hermione exhaled slowly, raising her wand again. The words came out quiet but sure. Her magic pulsed like a living thread beneath her skin, and at once the pebble exploded. She squeaked. "Reparo," she hissed as quickly as she could. The rock shards flew through the air once more, joining until whole. Hermione sighed and went back to practicing more. She took a steadying breath, eyes closing, and began to recite under her breath not an incantation, but the logic that had been her real magic all along. Form defines matter. But what defines form? Master Capel's words wove through her thoughts like a chant. The book on partial transfigurations lay open beside her, and her parchment margins were crowded with her tight handwriting. All those notes, and yet she struggled to master its most basic version. Partial change requires a boundary, she reminded herself. The caster must will the world to stop halfway to decide what shall remain and what shall transform. Her first attempts had gone wrong because she had approached it like just any other spell, focusing on it fully. But it wasn't about fully focusing, was it? It was about division. Two truths in the same space, held apart by will, and she was used to that. In a way, she was both Hermione Granger and Hermione Morgenstern. Master Capel had said partial transfiguration was akin to doing something accidental, intentionalish, needn't worry over the details. That was all too very mundane. Attempt after attempt ensued. But Hermione's mind was swirling all her knowledge of the relevant theories. The spell models that indescribable feeling of her, only 6 at the time, stomping her foot and secret garden flying down the shelves. Small smile Professor McGonagall had given her the first day of Hogwarts classes, when she'd been the only one to make any change to her needle at a leech try failed. But Hermione didn't let herself feel the frustration. Her mind was in flux, focused and unfocused at once, sure and unsure in equal measures. She was as preoccupied with the scope as she was outside of the scope. She felt the magic form, taking shaping with that telltale tingle in her wrist, and released it and held it at once, and the pebble quivered. For an instant, it seemed to glimmer with the rays of spell light spilling from the sconces. Then, with a sound almost like a sigh, the transformation took. The surface of the upper half turned to glass. Perfect, flawless glass. Hermione's breath caught. She reached out a trembling hand and brushed it with her fingertip. The pebble's top was now slick and cold, but the bottom, as coarse as ever and the exact same speckled granite she'd started with. Hermione exhaled shakily. Her wand hand was trembling. She dared not blink. "I did it," she breathed. She cut herself off, laughing in giddy, dizzying relief. Quickly, so as to not wake Iva, she clamped a hand over her mouth, but some sound still slipped out. The dueling hall was a grand, vaulted space of black marble and dark glass, filled with the low hum of conversation and the gleam of spellfare still lingering from the morning's maintenance tests. Crimson-stitched banners of Durmstrang hung above the arena floor, the silver double-headed eagles rippling faintly with enchantments that made them look like they were flapping their wings. The stands were packed students from both schools pressed together, murmuring with excitement. Hermione and Astrid sat on each side of Emil. Hermione's stomach was in knots, and she could feel the tight pull of fatigue under her eyes from the sleepless night spent practicing. Emil, ever the calm observer, leaned forward on his knees. "They say the dueling representatives are chosen through the winter trials," he told her quietly, smiling a little as if to cheer her up. "A kind of internal tournament where the 5 best are chosen to represent the school. Mostly 7th years, of course, though Luca made it last year as a 5th year, which is nearly unheard of. He's a great duelist, even if he's an arse." Hermione nodded, trying to smile back. "So it's merit-based, not just the professor's favorites, then?" "A bit of both," Emil said, snorting. "Durmstrang likes to pretend it's a pure meritocracy, but politics exists everywhere. Master Rommel's known to like Litvak, and he and Varric are the ones who choose the participants and judge the winter trials, since they teach the most combative courses here." "So Varric doesn't like him as much then?" asked Hermione, frowning. "Nobody likes Luca much, but talent can make up for temperament, can't it?" cut in Astrid, smiling before adding, "Not always, though. Some people are just too insufferable no matter what." "Is that supposed to mean something?" Hermione snapped. "Say it outright, or don't say it at all, Astrid." At this, Emil looked as if he wanted to shrink into himself. Astrid simply blinked. "Touchy today, Hermione." "Is it that time of the month already?" Hermione's jaw tightened as she tried to rein her annoyance in. "A bit," she said. "And no, it's not that. I was just in the library for a long time last night, and, well, I don't want to say anything, but I saw Lars being really close with another girl. I just felt so bad for you. Since you've spent so long gushing about him, I suppose I've been a little snappish, keeping it in. Sorry." Hermione tried to replicate Astrid's sweet smile before looking again at the arena. Astrid's eyes narrowed, and Emil gave her a sidelong look, one corner of his mouth twitching. "That girl was probably just his cousin Olma," he said after a moment, trying to sound comforting. "As if that matters," Astrid gritted out, glaring at the dueling platform. "So were my parents, and look how that turned out." Astrid brightened slightly then. "Well, Dad'd leave Mum in the end. Maybe I can get Lars to do the same. Hopefully before he has a child, but beggars can't really be choosers." At once, a chime rang. For the opening duel, a tall 7th-year girl from Durmstrang, Clara Dragonov, strode confidently to the center, her long black hair tied back with a crimson cord. Her opponent, an oak-like boy about her age, moved more cautiously, his wand trembling slightly as he bowed. The announcer's voice echoed overhead in a magically amplified boom, and then, "Begin!" Clara didn't hesitate. A burst of blue light erupted from her wand, so fast it left streaks across Hermione's vision. The oak-like boy deflected it, but his counterspell was clumsy, leaving an opening. She exploited it instantly. A twist of her wrist, a sharp word, and a spiral of orange flame flared around his wand arm. The crowd gasped, and Hermione's breath caught. But the oak-like boy rallied, summoning a gust of wind to blow out the flames. He tried a chain of hexes next, quick and desperate. Clara deflected each one with almost lazy grace, then flicked her wand upward, batting his own spell back and slamming him on the other end of the wall. The hall erupted in cheers. Hermione watched, heart pounding. The power in that arena was intoxicating. For a flicker of a moment, she could almost see herself there commanding that much force, silencing her enemies, never again afraid of anyone who thought they could expose her. How she wished she could do that to Varric still, she murmured to Emil. It's not really fair. Durmstrang recruits the best from all of Central, Northern, and Eastern Europe. Oaklight's just a small local school. They never stood a chance. Emil shrugged, smiling. Fairness isn't a word we use much here. Hermione watched as the next duelists took their places, the air thick with anticipation. Her fingers curled in her lap. She couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to stand down there, to be truly respected. The second duel started in short order. Two boys stepped into the ring, both seventh years by the look of them, one from Oaklight, nervous but determined, and one from Durmstrang, a tall, red-haired brute with shoulders like a troll's. The moment the duel began, it was a storm. The Durmstrang boy swung his wand in broad, sweeping gestures, throwing off waves of raw power, gouts of fire, concussive blasts, and shards of ice, while the Oaklight boy scrambled to deflect and dodge, each movement frantic. Hermione's heart clenched as she watched the smaller boy try to cast a shield, only for it to shatter like glass under the next hit. He was lifted clear off his feet, the safety barrier flashing red again as the duel ended in less than a minute. The third match lasted longer. Two girls this time, both quick and nimble. The Durmstrang student, a sixth-year named Milna Karvak, specialized in illusion spells. Hermione recognized the smoky mirages twisting through the air, false doubles and flickering copies that made it impossible for her opponent to tell which was real. But the Oaklight girl was clever. She cast a revealing charm that made the illusions waver and fired a counter-curse through the distortion. For a few shining moments, she held her own until Milna went invisible. She tried to cast the human revealing spell, but a non-verbal knockback jinx sent her flying backwards before she could. The crowd roared. Hermione found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed despite herself. The fourth duel began then. The Oaklight student this time was a blond boy with sharp, scrunched-up features and an intensity that drew Hermione's attention immediately. Marcus Adler, the announcer, called him. His opponent, a seventh-year Durmstrang girl, Nadia Arnav, with a reputation for cruelty, sneered at him before they even bowed. They bowed, barely, and then a jet of red light cracked through the air like a whip. But Marcus didn't flinch. He slipped sideways, graceful as a dancer, his wand flicking once. The curse veered mid-flight, curved by a translucent shimmer, and crashed harmlessly into the shield wall. Nadia was already firing again, 1, 2, 3 hexes in rapid succession. Marcus didn't raise a shield. He turned them instead. With eerie calm, he caught each spell in motion, redirecting them like a conductor with a silent orchestra. Crimson streaks bent and spun, forming a chaotic spiral that forced Nadia to dive aside, dodging her own magic. Hermione knew hex deflection, but she had never heard of bending a spell's shape in such a way. Her breath hitched slightly. His ability wasn't born of athleticism or aggression, it was pure magical skill. Nadia pressed forward, snarling, but Marcus moved through her barrage like water. He conjured snarling golems from the dust. She blasted them apart. Transfigured a hail of ink-black birds, she turned them back midair. He summoned a sudden cyclone of wind. She nearly lost her footing, raising a shield. She was always reacting now, Hermione saw. Marcus was weaving between charms, transfigurations, and curses with a rare sort of ease, and all Nadia could do was endlessly react. Her rhythm fractured. Then, as she shouted a fire-scorching spell to snuff out the cursed flames licking at her boots, Marcus lifted his wand and murmured a single, low word. The floor beneath Nadia glowed faintly, then melted like wax beneath her boots. At once, she slipped. Her wand skidded across the floor before she even realized it had left her hand. Silence followed. Hermione expected cheers at the amazing display, but instead, the Durmstrang students booed, sharp and hostile, and even the Oaklite section clapped only half-heartedly, as though embarrassed by his win. Marcus, standing alone on the platform, bowed stiffly and turned away, his face pale but proud. Hermione frowned. He was incredible. Why? Emily's lip twisted faintly. Marcus Adler, Muggle-born. He won his match last year too. People wonder as to how. Because he was better than his opponent, Hermione said slowly. Don't we all have eyes? Emily's lips pressed together, and he gave a jerky sort of shrug. Astrid, on the other hand, laughed. Oh, don't bother with Emil, she said, rolling her eyes. He's Velstrian. They'll never not insist Muggle-borns can't do magic at all, which begs the question of why they're Muggle-borns and not Muggles, really. That only applies to certain kinds of magic, said Emil tightly. Beaute's true that Muggle-borns tend not to be as good at most sorts of magic. Their minds are less developed. Less developed, Hermione demanded, aghast. That's not true at all. Around her, students began to peer harshly, whispering among themselves. Immediately, Hermione shut up, swallowing. Emil looked a little embarrassed, too. Velstria's not the only nation with those beliefs, all right, he said. Most European nations don't have Britain's extreme views. I mean, Astrid can talk all she wants, but Velstria allows Muggle-borns to go to their own schools, even. They're not like us, but they still have their own, separate roles to perform in our society. Meanwhile, all of the Kalmar Union states, including Sweden, don't even allow Muggle-borns to know they're any different from their Muggle parents. Hermione's bushy eyebrows climbed even further. Durmstrang's history textbooks had not included that fact. How is the statute of secrecy upheld there, then? She asked. Wouldn't accidental magic continue from lots of the Muggle-borns if they're given no education at all? Not even for a few weeks, to show them the basics. Astrid rolled her eyes. We can stop Norwegian ridgebacks and other beasts from exposing magic without giving them their own special schools, she said, sniffing. Why not Muggle-borns too? It's not that hard to just memory charm them and the Muggles around every time they express magic. I mean, sure, I think some can be good, but there's a genuine question of whether spending precious resource for people accumulated on people who have contributed nothing is smart. It's not out of a dumb belief they can't cast magic properly, like Velstrians think. They're probably just like us. But why would we help them? Out of the goodness of our hearts. She giggled as if that were a ridiculous notion. Before Hermione could respond in horror to that as well, the announcer called Luca Litvak's name for the final bout. The hall seemed to shrink down to the sound of her own breathing. Hermione's palms were slick inside her gloves. Her fingers folded around the haft of her wand beneath the long sleeve of her robe, the vine warm and steady against her skin. Emil and Astrid began chattering away on some other topic, but Hermione hardly heard it. She could feel him glance once toward her, question in his look. She gave him only a small nod and smile. Luca stepped into the ring with the easy arrogance that came from too many wins and too much praise. He was younger than the other seventh years by a hair, wiry and quick, eyes like polished coal. He'd been described to her as talented in the dark arts and temperamental. Up close, he carried the self-confidence of a man who expected to bend the world to his will. Across from him, the Oaklite duelist stood, jaw set, hands steady. No one expected the lip boy to win, but the match would be a test of nerve either way. Hermione's plan narrowed into a single, cold line of steps in her mind. Everything since that scrap of parchment had led here. Thus, she had two crucial needs: absolute precision and absolute deniability. Partial transfiguration required her to define the boundary of change in space with exacting clarity, where the matter would accept a different form and where it would not. Whole object transfiguration set its own scope. Partials demanded that she draw the line herself. Tonight, the line had to be a foot's width under Luca's favored stance, just enough to alter the stone's traction, so his foot would slide at the exact millisecond his opponent struck. Too large or too strong, and someone would notice a fault in the ring; too weak, and nothing would happen. The duel started with a literal bang. Spells flared a volley of bright, rehearsed magic. Luca moved with confidence, but his opponent was no fool. Hermione felt every hex like a bell in her chest. She watched Luca's habits like a hawk, cataloguing each. The slight turn of his left shoulder before he planted his foot, the way he favored the inside edge of the ring when he launched a non-verbal jab. She had to be simultaneous with that wand movement, no more than a breath before his weight settled for the partial change to mean anything. She let the world thin to a pinpoint of concentration on one tiny area of the stone platform. She pictured the patch of stone in her mind not as an expanse to be consumed, but as a circle to be carved into being. The boundary had to be exact, a ring within the ring, a little island of altered surface that would not spread. Her wand slipped from her sleeve for the fraction of an instant she needed, performing those almost hidden motions as she whispered the incantation. Magic leapt, but it did not surge as she entered that hazy, ill-defined mental state where she both cared and didn't. The sharp, distinct click of the boundary fastening into place echoing in her mind. For a breath, a tiny stone under the far dueling quarter seemed, to her alone, to thin at the surface, a film of gloss spreading like ice over rough rock. But she could barely see it, for it was far too small. Still, she tightened her mental hold just enough to keep the change in flux, no more than a tenuous promise. Then Luca planted his foot. His left boot slipped a fraction of an inch where solidity had been a certainty. The movement that should have been rooted transferred into a small, flailing correction. He stumbled forward just a beat, a quick, clumsy step, and his opponent seized the moment with surgical speed. A disarm that was practiced and clean, a short sweep that left Luca off balance and his wand skittering. Hermione let the boundary dissolve at once, the tiny patch of stone hopefully reassuming its ordinary roughness. A tiny, shocked sound passed through the Durmstrang side of the hall, followed by roars of triumph from Oaklight. The Durmstrang section was silent for a moment before tepidly clapping. No one looked directly toward her. No one pinned the moment to a visible source. She was safe. Hermione exhaled so slowly she felt it leave her in a whisper. Her hands, damp and trembling, curled around her wand. She felt awful. Emil looked at her oddly, and his hand found her shoulder. His grip tightened, and he murmured very near her ear, "You all right?" She met his eyes and nodded. Her voice was small when she said, "I'm fine."